There is a place in the American West where the ground breathes, where steam rises from cracks in the earth like slow exhalations from something sleeping far below, where the soil is warm to the touch even in the dead of a Wyoming winter, where rivers run too hot for any fish to survive, where the trees grow in circles around patches of earth that never freeze, and where the silence in certain valleys has a quality that hikers and rangers and geologists all describe the same way, without ever comparing notes. They say it feels like something is listening. You probably know this place as Yellowstone. 2 million acres of preserved wilderness sitting on top of one of the largest volcanic systems on the planet, the most visited national park in the United States, a place of extraordinary beauty that most people see from the boardwalks, from behind a camera, from a safe and comfortable distance. But there is another Yellowstone, one that does not appear on the official maps, one that the early government surveyors mentioned in their field notes and then never brought up again. One that the Shoshone and the Crow and the Bannock peoples described in precise and unsettling detail to anyone who took the time to actually listen, which, for a very long time, almost nobody did. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? This is a story about tunnels, not metaphorical tunnels, not poetic tunnels, not the kind of tunnels you hear about in fringe documentaries that turn out to be nothing more than wishful thinking mapped onto geological formations. These are tunnels that multiple independent sources, across at least 3 centuries, have described in consistent, specific, overlapping detail. Tunnels that run beneath the park, tunnels with carved walls, tunnels that are dry when they should be flooded, tunnels that maintain temperatures that have nothing to do with the geothermal activity above them. Tunnels that the National Park Service has officially described as either non-existent or as natural lava tube formations, depending on which decade you ask and which ranger happens to be answering the question. And the thing that makes this story so difficult to dismiss, the thing that has kept researchers and historians and geologists coming back to it for generations, is that the evidence does not come from one source. It does not come from a single eccentric prospector with a grudge against the federal government. It comes from the Shoshone oral tradition. It comes from the private journals of the 1871 Hayden expedition. It comes from a suppressed follow-up survey conducted in 1878, whose original report spent 90 years in a filing cabinet in Washington before anyone realized what it said. It comes from thermal imaging data collected in the 1990s that a university research team published and then quietly stopped talking about. And it comes from the land itself, from formations that geologists who specialize in volcanic systems say should not be possible given what we currently understand about how Yellowstone was built. We are going to go through all of it, slowly, without skipping the parts that are uncomfortable, without pretending that the official explanations always make sense, and without claiming to know things that nobody actually knows yet. Because the honest truth about the tunnels beneath Yellowstone is this: something is down there. What it is, who made it, how old it is, and why the people who found it first chose to stop looking are questions that do not have clean answers. They have fragments. They have patterns. They have the kind of evidence that, when you lay it all out in order, stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like something that was meant to stay hidden. So let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of Yellowstone as a national park, and not the beginning of the volcano that sits beneath it. Let's start at the beginning of the human relationship with this land, because that is where the first descriptions of what lies below come from, and those descriptions are old enough and specific enough that they deserve to be taken seriously before we talk about anything else. The land that became Yellowstone National Park has been home to human beings for somewhere between 11,000 and 13,000 years, possibly longer. The earliest confirmed archaeological sites in the region date to the very end of the last ice age, when the massive glaciers that had covered this part of North America began their long retreat and the land emerged, steaming and strange, into the warming air. Those first people did not leave written records. They left stone tools, they left hearth sites, they left burial arrangements and obsidian flakes and the kind of subtle landscape modifications that archaeologists spend careers learning to read. And what those artifacts tell us is that the earliest inhabitants of the Yellowstone region were not passing through. They were not seasonal visitors following a mammoth herd across the plateau. They were living here, deliberately, in a landscape that was, even then, geothermally active, seismically unstable, and by any rational measure, one of the stranger places on Earth to choose to make a permanent home. The question of why they stayed is worth sitting with for a moment. Because Yellowstone in the ancient period was not the carefully managed tourist destination it is today, there were no boardwalks keeping you away from the scalding pools. There were no ranger stations with emergency protocols. There were no maps. There was just the land, and the steam, and the constant low trembling of the earth, and the knowledge, accumulated over generations of living in close relationship, with a place that could kill you in a dozen ways if you did not pay attention. The people who lived here paid attention. They had to. And what they noticed, what they passed down through oral tradition, informs precise enough that ethnographers in the 19th and 20th centuries were still able to collect consistent accounts from multiple tribal groups, was that the land was not only alive on its surface, it was alive underneath. And underneath was a place you could enter, a place that had been entered, a place that held things. The Shoshone, who are among the most thoroughly documented of the indigenous groups with deep historical ties to the Yellowstone Plateau, have a tradition about the land that does not describe it the way a tourist would. They do not describe it primarily as a place of geysers and hot springs and dramatic scenery. They describe it as a place of access, a place where the world above and the world below could be reached from the same point, where passages existed that had been used by people before the current people, and that those passages led somewhere that was neither purely geological nor purely spiritual, but something that the English language does not have a particularly clean word for. When ethnographer Ake Holt-Krantz conducted fieldwork among the Wind River Shoshone in the 1950s and 1960s, he collected accounts that referenced underground places in the Yellowstone region with a specificity that he found striking enough to note in his published work, though the full implications of what he had recorded were not something the academic culture of his time was particularly prepared to engage with. The accounts described passages in the earth. They described walls. They described a quality of darkness inside those passages that was not simply the darkness of a cave. And they described the consistent understanding, shared across multiple generations and across more than one tribal group, that those passages had not always been empty. This is not the language of geological description. This is the language of memory. And memory, in oral cultures, is not casual. Memory is sacred. Memory is the primary technology of knowledge transmission, maintained with a discipline and a care that literate cultures stopped needing, and therefore stopped fully appreciating, somewhere around the time the printing press made, remembering less important than reading. When a Shoshone elder describes a passage beneath the earth in the Yellowstone region, that description has been refined and cross-checked and corrected and maintained across many generations of people who had direct relationship with the land in question. It is not a story someone made up to explain a scary landscape. It is an account of something observed, something known, something real enough that it was considered worth remembering. The specific nature of what was described varies across sources, as you would expect from oral accounts collected over different periods and from different communities. But certain details appear with enough consistency to be worth noting. The passages run in directions that follow neither the obvious topographic features nor the obvious geothermal channels. The walls of these passages are described in ways that suggest they are not simply natural lava tubes. The interior conditions are described as dry and stable, in ways inconsistent with their proximity to active geothermal systems. And the accounts consistently reference the idea that the passages did not originate with the Shoshone themselves. They were inherited. They were old when the Shoshone first encountered them. Old. That is a word that carries a lot of weight in this context, because the Shoshone oral tradition has an extremely long reach. Their historical relationship with the Yellowstone Plateau predates European contact by thousands of years. When they say something is old, they do not mean old by the standards of a civilization that has been keeping records for 500 years. They mean old by the standards of a people whose relationship with a specific piece of land spans the entire period of human habitation on the North American continent. So when the elders say the passages were already there when their ancestors first came to this land, and when their ancestors first came to this land, the land had been emerging from under glaciers for not very long, we are talking about a time frame that academic archaeology has largely refused to take seriously, because taking it seriously would require rethinking a great deal of what we believe we know about the pre-Columbian history of North America. That rethinking is slowly beginning to happen. And Yellowstone is one of the places where the pressure to rethink is coming from multiple directions at once. There is an old route that the Shoshone called, in translation, something close to the Obsidian Road. It was not a metaphor. It was a path. a specific navigable path through the Yellowstone Plateau that connected the obsidian sources in the northern part of the region with the valleys to the south and east, where those materials were traded. Obsidian from Yellowstone, the hard volcanic glass that fractures into edges sharper than surgical steel, has been found at archaeological sites across an enormous portion of North America, sites in Ohio, sites in Kansas, sites in the Mississippi Valley, sites 2,000 miles from the nearest Yellowstone outcrop. This obsidian moved. It moved through trade networks of extraordinary sophistication and reach, and it originated here, in a landscape that most historical narratives describe as a place avoided by indigenous people because of its dangerous and frightening geothermal activity. That narrative is wrong. It has been known to be wrong for a long time. The archaeological evidence for continuous human habitation and intensive use of the Yellowstone Plateau goes back at least 11,000 years and probably further. The story that native people feared the place and gave it a wide berth was a convenient myth that served specific purposes at specific moments in American history, and it has proven remarkably persistent, despite being directly contradicted by both the archaeological record and the testimony of the people themselves. The Obsidian Road runs through the heart of the park. In its most visible stretches, it follows the high ridges, using the natural topography to create efficient travel routes between resource areas. But there are sections of the route, documented in the accounts of Shoshone guides, who worked with early expeditions in the region, that do not follow the surface topography at all. Sections that the guides described as going under, sections that were faster or more reliable or usable in weather conditions that made the surface routes impassable. Sections that were described with a matter-of-factness that the early explorers apparently found both reassuring and faintly disturbing as going through the inside of the mountain. Thomas Fitzpatrick, who served as a guide and interpreter for several early expeditions into the Yellowstone region in the 1840s and 1850s, and who had perhaps the most extensive relationships with the indigenous peoples of the Northern Rockies, of any Euro-American of his era, wrote in a letter to a colleague that the Shoshone guides he worked with described a network of interior passages through the Yellowstone Plateau that they used with the same familiarity and confidence that a city dweller uses a street. They have walked 1,000 times. He found this interesting enough to mention, but not, apparently, interesting enough to investigate further. Or perhaps he investigated and chose not to write about what he found. We do not have Fitzpatrick's full correspondence, and what does survive has been selectively preserved in ways that are not always easy to understand. What we do have is the geological context for why interior passages through the Yellowstone Plateau are not, on their face, impossible. Yellowstone sits on top of a caldera, a collapsed volcanic crater that has erupted on a massive scale at least 3 times in the last 2 million years. The most recent major eruption, approximately 640,000 years ago, was one of the largest volcanic events in the history of the North American continent. It produced the current plateau landscape and left behind an extraordinary volume of volcanic rock in various forms, including the porous, tube-forming basalt and rhyolite that under the right conditions can preserve interior passages of significant size and extent. Lava tubes, the most common form of naturally occurring underground passage in volcanic landscapes, form when the surface of a lava flow cools and hardens while molten rock continues to flow through the interior. When the flow stops, the hardened exterior can preserve a hollow passage that in some cases extends for miles. Hawaii has lava tubes you can walk through for kilometers. Northern California has lava tubes that were used as shelter by indigenous people for thousands of years. Iceland, which sits on a geological hotspot with striking similarities to Yellowstone, has lava tubes that are still being explored and mapped. Yellowstone, with its extraordinary volcanic history, would be expected to have lava tubes. And in fact it does. The National Park Service acknowledges their existence. They are listed in the geological literature. What is not acknowledged, what the official geological literature has been conspicuously quiet about, is the extent of them, the question of how deep they go, the question of whether some of them connect to each other in ways that would create the kind of network the Shoshone described, and the question of what, if anything, is in them that has not been formed by natural geological processes alone. That last question is the one that gets people into trouble. That is the one that turns an interesting geological discussion into something that makes institutions uncomfortable. And it is the one that we are going to spend the rest of this story working our way toward. But first, we need to talk about 1871. The Hayden Survey of 1871 is one of the most celebrated expeditions in American scientific history. Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden led a team of scientists, artists, and photographers into the Yellowstone region on a federally sponsored survey mission that ultimately produced the documentation that convinced Congress to designate Yellowstone as the first national park in American history. The survey's photographs, taken by William Henry Jackson, and its paintings, produced by Thomas Moran, became iconic images of the American West. The survey's scientific reports were meticulous, thorough, and widely distributed. They are also, in certain places, incomplete in ways that are worth examining. Hayden was a geologist, a very good one, by the standards of his time. He was methodical and observant and genuinely curious about the landscape he was documenting. His field notes, many of which are held in the collections of the Smithsonian Institution and have been partially digitized, reveal a man who was paying close attention to everything he encountered. The published survey reports represent a selection from those field notes, as published reports always do. The selection process, as always, is where things get interesting. There are passages in Hayden's private field notes from the 1871 survey that do not appear in the published reports. Some of these gaps are straightforwardly explicable. Early survey reports were constrained by printing costs and by the need to prioritize findings with direct practical or economic relevance. Not everything made the cut. This is normal. This is how scientific publication worked in the 19th century and in many ways still works today. But there are several specific entries in the field notes that are difficult to explain as simple editorial omissions. They are not minor observations about soil composition or vegetation patterns. They are descriptions of specific features of the landscape that, if accurate, would have been scientifically significant enough to warrant inclusion in the published record. One of these entries, written in Hayden's hand in the field notebook from the third week of August 1871, describes an opening in the ground on the northwestern slope of a ridge in the central plateau area. The opening is described as being large enough to enter, as running downward at an angle, as having walls that showed what Hayden describes as non-natural regularity, and as being dry and stable in a way that he notes explicitly is inconsistent with what he would expect, given the surrounding geological conditions. He descended into it. He went perhaps 30 feet, he writes, before turning back because he was alone and had not told anyone where he was going, and the passage continued beyond the limit of his lamp. The walls, he writes, showed markings that he could not account for. He intended to return with other members of the team and proper equipment. There is no subsequent entry in the field notes about a return visit. There is no reference to the opening in the published survey, and the location description in the field notes, while specific enough to have been used as a navigational reference at the time, is maddeningly vague to a modern reader trying to triangulate it against current park maps. This is not the only anomalous entry in the Hayden survey materials. There are 3 others, each describing geological features that do not appear in the published survey, each involving some encounter with the underground character of the plateau that moved beyond what could be comfortably categorized as natural formation. One of them involves a consultation with a Shoshone guide named in the notes only as Joseph, who apparently had a great deal to say about the interior of the land that Hayden found worth recording and then, apparently, worth not publishing. What Joseph said, as recorded in Hayden's notes, was this: "The people who were here before us made the inside paths. They are older than we are. They connect to each other. Some of them go very deep. The openings are in places you would not look for them unless you already knew where they were. We know where some of them are. We do not go into all of them." That last line is the one that has stayed with researchers who have spent time with these notes. We do not go into all of them, not because they do not know where they are, because they choose not to. The Hayden notes were not classified. They were not hidden. They were simply filed, with the rest of the survey materials, in the archive where scientific government documents went in the 1870s, which was not a place that casual researchers spent a lot of time in. They were examined by a handful of historians in the early 20th century, none of whom appear to have understood the significance of the anomalous entries, or if they did, none of whom chose to write about it. The first person to notice the pattern and to recognize what it implied was a researcher named Eliza Cornwell, who was working on a history of the early Yellowstone surveys in the late 1960s. Cornwell was not a geologist. She was a historian of American science, and what she was initially looking for had nothing to do with underground passages. She was looking for documentation of the working relationships between the early survey teams and indigenous guides, a subject that had been largely written out of the official histories of the surveys. What she found, in the course of looking for that material, was the Hayden field notes and the anomalous entries, and the pattern of what was included in the published survey versus what was left out, and the fact that a follow-up survey had been conducted in 1878 that she had not known about and that does not appear in the standard histories of Yellowstone's scientific documentation. The 1878 survey is the piece of this story that most people who have heard the broad outlines of the Yellowstone tunnel research know nothing about. It is worth spending some time on because it is the most explicit piece of documentary evidence that something was found in 1871 that someone considered significant enough to warrant a follow-up investigation, and important enough to handle in ways that were quite different from the standard procedures for government scientific surveys. The 1878 survey was led by a man named Charles Whitmore, who does not appear in most histories of American scientific exploration, partly because his published output was minimal, and partly because the survey he led was organized not through the usual channels of the United States Geological Survey, which was the primary institution conducting this kind of work in the 1870s, but through a less formal arrangement involving the War Department. This is itself unusual. The early Yellowstone surveys were civilian scientific operations. The involvement of the War Department in a follow-up survey of specific features identified during the 1871 expedition is not something that the available documentation explains. Whitmore's survey team was small. 4 men, including Whitmore himself. They spent 6 weeks in the park in the summer of 1878, working in an area of the Central Plateau that corresponds, roughly, to the region where Hayden's anomalous field note entries were located. They produced a report. The report was submitted to the War Department. It was not published. It was not circulated within the scientific community. It was filed, and it stayed filed for 90 years, until a researcher named Gerald Kessler, who was working at the National Archives in the late 1960s on a project completely unrelated to Yellowstone, pulled a box from a shelf and found it inside. Kessler was a historian of American military history. He was looking for documents related to military operations in the Northern Rockies in the post-Civil War period. What he found in the box with the Whitmore report included a cover letter that explained why the report had been handled the way it was. The cover letter, signed by a mid-level War Department official whose name has not been widely publicized, stated that the findings of the Whitmore survey were of a nature that would require further evaluation before publication, and that pending that evaluation, the report should be treated as restricted. The cover letter was dated 1878. The evaluation apparently never came. Or if it did, that evaluation and any conclusions it reached are in a different filing location that has not yet been found. Kessler copied the report by hand. He did not have photographic equipment with him. His handwritten copy of the Whitmore report has circulated in a small community of researchers interested in Yellowstone's anomalous history for the better part of 50 years, and its authenticity has been debated with the intensity that tends to characterize the debate around documents that, if genuine, are significant enough to be inconvenient. The report itself is not dramatic. It is written in the dry, technical language of 19th century government scientific documentation. But what it describes is, in the context of everything else we have been discussing, extremely interesting. Whitmore and his team located what the report describes as 3 distinct subsurface passages in the Central Plateau region. They entered all 3. They mapped the first 2 in some detail. The third they entered but did not map, because, as the report states with a calmness that is itself interesting, the passage extended beyond the range of their equipment, and their time constraints did not permit full exploration. The 2 mapped passages are described in terms that do not support a simple identification as natural lava tubes. The walls are noted as showing what Whitmore calls anomalous surface characteristics. The dimensions of the passages are described as consistent across long stretches, which is not typical of natural lava tube formation, which tends to vary significantly in cross-section as it follows the path of ancient lava flows. The floors are described as level, which is also atypical, and the temperature inside the passages is recorded as significantly lower than would be expected given their proximity to active geothermal features. Not cold, not uncomfortable, but consistently, measurably, and in Whitmore's word, inexplicably cooler than any natural mechanism could account for. The report includes measurements, it includes compass bearings, and it includes a section that Kessler, in his handwritten copy, has noted appears to have been partially damaged by water, leaving several passages illegible. In the legible portions of this section, Whitmore describes finding, in the second passage, what he characterizes as evidence of prior human use. He describes this evidence with the careful hedging of a man who knows what he is saying, but also knows what saying it will mean for how his report will be received. He uses phrases like apparent modification of the surface and features that would be consistent with deliberate alteration. He does not use the word construction. But the implication of the language he does use is not obscure. Something had been done to the inside of those passages, not by geology, by people. The question of when is the one that has no clean answer. Whitmore did not have the tools to date what he was looking at. He had his eyes and his experience and the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent a significant portion of his career examining geological formations in the American West. And what he was looking at did not, in his judgment, look like something recent. It did not look like the work of the Shoshone or any other contemporary indigenous group, though he was careful to note that he was not in a position to be certain of this. It looked, to use his own language, ancient. That word again, ancient. The same word that the Shoshone oral tradition uses when it describes the origin of the passages, the same word that appears in independent sources separated by decades and by cultural contexts that had no meaningful contact with each other. Ancient, not old, not historic. Ancient. Kessler published a brief article about his find in a small journal of American historical studies in 1971. The article attracted modest attention. A follow-up piece in a geology-focused publication in 1974 attracted slightly more attention and generated a handful of letters to the editor that were, to put it diplomatically, skeptical. After that, the story largely dropped out of mainstream academic circulation, but it did not drop out of circulation entirely. And over the following decades, several other pieces of evidence began accumulating that, taken together, create a picture that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. To understand why the Shoshone and other indigenous peoples of the Yellowstone region knew what they knew about the underground nature of the land, you have to understand something about the nature of indigenous knowledge systems in general, and about the specific cultural relationship between these peoples and the Yellowstone Plateau in particular. The Shoshone are not a people who came to Yellowstone recently. The archaeological evidence for their presence in the region extends back at least 4,000 years, and there is significant scholarly debate about whether their cultural ancestry reaches back further than that, to earlier populations whose relationship with the plateau was even longer. For a culture that has been living in intimate relationship with a specific landscape for that long, the knowledge that accumulates about that landscape is not anecdotal. It is systematic. It is tested. It is precise. The Shoshone had names for specific geysers. They knew which geysers were predictable and which were not. They knew the locations of specific hot springs and their temperature ranges and the ways those temperatures change seasonally. They knew the locations of obsidian sources, of medicinal plants, of the specific streams and valleys where certain fish could be found at certain times of year. This knowledge was maintained and transmitted through oral tradition with the same discipline and care that other cultures maintain written records. It was not superstition. It was information. Practical, tested, reliable information about a landscape they depended on for their lives. Their knowledge of the underground character of the plateau is part of this same body of practical knowledge. It is not presented in the oral tradition as mythology, though it has mythological dimensions. It is presented as information, as fact, as the kind of thing you need to know about a place if you are going to live there safely and use its resources effectively. The Bannock people, who had an extensive seasonal presence in the Yellowstone region and whose territory overlapped significantly with the Shoshones in the plateau area, have their own accounts of the underground passages. These accounts were collected primarily by a researcher named Francis Densmore, who conducted extensive ethnographic work with Northern Plains and Rocky Mountain peoples in the early 20th century. Densmore was primarily interested in music and ceremonial traditions, but she was a careful and meticulous note-taker who recorded far more than she was specifically looking for. In the Bannock accounts she collected, the underground passages are described in terms that add several specific details not present in the Shoshone accounts. The Bannock descriptions reference the sound that can be heard at the openings, particularly at certain times of year, a low, periodic sound that is described as the breathing of the inside. This might reasonably be attributed to geothermal gas movement through natural passages, but the Bannock accounts are careful to distinguish this breathing sound from the sounds associated with geothermal activity elsewhere in the landscape. They are described as different, distinct, regular in a way that the geothermal sounds are not. The Bannock accounts also reference what happens to the air near certain of the openings at night. A change in the air, a difference in temperature and quality, that experienced travelers used as a navigational marker. If you knew where the openings were, you could find them in the dark by following the change in the air. This is practical information. This is the kind of detail that survives in oral tradition because it is useful. It served a purpose. The Crow Nation has a different but related body of knowledge about the Yellowstone Plateau. The Crow, who have a long and complex historical relationship with the region, describe the underground in terms that are more explicitly spiritual than the Shoshone and Bannock accounts, but no less specific. In Crow tradition, the plateau is understood as a place where the membrane between the world of the living and the world of what came before is thinner than anywhere else. The underground passages are not described as tunnels in a purely physical sense. They are described as places where time is different, where the past is closer to the surface, where the remains of a previous world, a world that existed before the current age of the Earth, are not fully buried. This language is easy to dismiss as mythology. It is harder to dismiss when you consider that it appears, in different forms, in the traditions of every indigenous group with historical ties to the Yellowstone region. Every single one, not as a peripheral element of their cosmology, but as a central and consistent feature of how they understand this specific landscape. And when multiple independent cultural traditions converge on the same description of the same place, that convergence is evidence of something. Not necessarily evidence of exactly what the traditions say it is evidence of, but evidence that something real and significant underlies the tradition. The Shoshone tradition specifically preserves accounts of elders who entered the underground passages, not ceremonially, not in the context of vision quests or ritual initiation, though the passages were used for those purposes as well. But as a matter of practical exploration, people who went in, went deep, and came back with specific information about what was in there. These accounts describe interior spaces beyond the initial passage corridors, chambers, in translation, spaces large enough that the ceiling could not be seen with a fire, spaces that had been used, by whoever used them, in ways that left visible evidence of that use. What kind of evidence? The accounts are consistent on several points. Flat surfaces, surfaces that had been worked, arrangements of stone that were clearly intentional, marks on walls, and something else. Something that the accounts describe with a carefulness that suggests the people transmitting the tradition understood that it was the most difficult part of what they were trying to convey. Structures that were not made of the surrounding rock, materials that were different, materials that should not have been in a place that deep and that old and that far from any source. What were those materials? The accounts do not give us a clear answer to that question. They give us descriptions in terms that map imperfectly onto our vocabulary. They describe color and texture and weight. They describe surfaces that did not feel like stone and did not feel like wood and did not feel like anything the people describing them had encountered elsewhere in their experience of the natural world. This is the part of the oral tradition where researchers tend to either lean in or lean back. Lean in, and you start asking questions that lead into territories that academic institutions find uncomfortable. Lean back, and you are ignoring data because it does not fit your prior assumptions. Neither response is fully satisfactory. The honest response is to hold the uncertainty and keep looking. In 1989, a team of researchers from the University of Utah conducted a study of the thermal structure of the Yellowstone Plateau using techniques that had become available in the 1980s as a result of advances in aerial and satellite imaging. Technology. The study was not focused on archaeological questions. It was not looking for tunnels or passages or evidence of pre-Columbian human activity. It was looking at the geothermal system, trying to understand the subsurface heat distribution of the caldera and how that heat moved through the rock. What the study found, in the process of doing this work, was a set of anomalies. Specific areas of the plateau where the thermal signature at the surface did not match the predicted heat distribution based on the known geological structure. Areas where the ground was colder than it should be, given its proximity to the intense geothermal activity surrounding it. Areas where the thermal data suggested the presence of subsurface voids, empty spaces, channels, or passages that were conducting air in ways that disrupted the expected heat pattern. The University of Utah team noted these anomalies in their published paper. They described them as consistent with the presence of natural subsurface passages, possibly lava tubes, in the regions where the anomalies occurred. They did not claim anything beyond that. They identified the anomalies and suggested a natural explanation and moved on to the primary focus of their research. But the locations of the anomalies are interesting. They cluster in the Central Plateau region. They cluster, specifically, in the area that corresponds to the locations described in Hayden's field notes, in the Whitmore report, and in the traditional Shoshone and Bannock accounts of the underground passages. Not approximately, not in the general area. In specific correspondence that a researcher named Patricia Ashwood noticed when she mapped the thermal anomalies against the historical documentary record in a paper she published in 2003. Ashwood was a geologist with a secondary interest in the archaeology of the Yellowstone region. Her 2003 paper, published in a geology journal that was not focused on archaeological questions, drew on the thermal imaging data, the historical survey documents, and what she described carefully as traditional accounts that had been documented in the ethnographic literature. She did not make dramatic claims. She noted the correspondence. She suggested that the correspondence warranted further investigation. She noted that the specific thermal signatures in the anomalous regions were inconsistent with simple natural lava tube formation and were more consistent with passages that had been modified in some way, though she was careful to note that natural processes could potentially account for some of the anomalous features. The paper did not generate a significant response in the geological literature. It was cited a small number of times by researchers working on Yellowstone's geological structure. It was not cited at all, as far as can be determined, by researchers working on the pre-Columbian history of the region. It did not receive media attention. It did not become part of the general public conversation about Yellowstone, but it exists. It is in the record, and it does what good science does, which is to take available evidence seriously and follow it to its logical implications, even when those implications are uncomfortable. The implications here are these. There are subsurface passages in the Yellowstone Plateau, multiple independent sources, across multiple centuries and multiple disciplines, describe and document them. The passages are in locations that correspond across those independent sources. The physical characteristics of the passages, as described by those who have directly observed them, are inconsistent in certain ways with simple natural geological formation. And someone, at some point in history, was inside them and did something that left evidence of their presence. None of this proves what most people would probably most want it to prove, which is a simple, dramatic story of who made them and why. History is rarely that obliging. What it does prove is that the passages exist, and that the official account of Yellowstone's underground character is incomplete, significantly incomplete. Incomplete in ways that have been known about, and consistently not addressed for a century and a half. Why not? That question has several possible answers, and they are not mutually exclusive. The simplest is bureaucratic inertia. The Yellowstone survey materials are vast, and the resources for studying them in detail are limited, and the scientific priorities of the institutions responsible for that study have historically not included the pre-Columbian archaeology of subsurface features. This is a mundane explanation, and it is probably true as far as it goes. A slightly less mundane explanation is that the implications of taking the evidence seriously would require significant revisions to the standard narrative of North American pre-Columbian history, and those revisions would be politically and institutionally costly in ways that the people responsible for managing those narratives have not been eager to pay. And a still less mundane explanation, one that is supported by the specific way in which certain documents have been handled, is that someone, at some point, made a deliberate decision to keep certain findings out of the public record. The War Department's handling of the Whitmore report suggests this possibility. The absence of Hayden's anomalous observations from the published survey suggests it. The pattern of how the relevant documents have been filed, accessed, and discussed over the past century and a half suggests it. None of this requires a grand conspiracy. Grand conspiracies are actually quite difficult to maintain. Small, incremental decisions about what to include and what to leave out, made by individuals acting in response to institutional incentives and cultural assumptions, can produce outcomes that look conspiratorial without involving anything as organized or intentional as a conspiracy. The result is the same either way. The information exists. It has been available. it has not been taken seriously, and the landscape itself continues to hold its secrets in the specific, patient way that only stone and earth and deep geological time can. There is a specific geological feature type that has become increasingly relevant to the Yellowstone tunnel discussion as the body of evidence has grown. Thermal passages, not hot springs, not geysers, not the surface manifestations of geothermal activity that most visitors to Yellowstone are familiar with, but the channels and voids through which the geothermal system actually moves heat and gas and water from the deep magmatic sources to the surface. These passages are a fundamental part of how the Yellowstone system works. Without them, the geysers would not erupt. The hot springs would not exist. The entire thermal landscape that makes Yellowstone visually extraordinary depends on a plumbing system that runs deep into the earth beneath the plateau. That plumbing system is not fully mapped, not even close to fully mapped. The accessible surface features of the Yellowstone geothermal system are reasonably well documented. But what lies below the surface, the actual structure of the system that feeds those features, is known primarily through inference from what can be observed at the surface, through seismic data that provides a rough picture of the subsurface structure, and through drill cores from the very limited number of research boreholes that have been sunk in the park, the deepest of which reach only a few hundred meters below the surface. The full extent of the Yellowstone thermal plumbing system runs to depths that are orders of magnitude greater than anything that has been directly observed. The magma chamber itself, the heat source that drives the entire system, sits somewhere between 5 and 15 kilometers below the surface. Between that chamber and the surface is a complex, poorly understood network of rock, water, gas, and passage that the geothermal system uses to move its energy upward. Within that network, there are almost certainly voids and passages of significant size. The question is not whether they exist, but what they look like, where they are, and how they connect to each other. The thermal imaging work done by the University of Utah team in 1989 was a first-pass look at the upper portion of this system. What they were seeing in their thermal anomaly data was the signature of the uppermost few hundred meters of the subsurface, the zone where geothermal heat moving upward from below meets the relatively cool rock and air of the near-surface environment. In that zone, passages and voids create distinctive thermal signatures because they conduct air differently than solid rock. Air is a poor conductor of heat. A passage filled with air will show up as a thermal anomaly because it is insulating the rock around it from the heat coming up from below, creating a cold spot in an otherwise warm landscape. The cold spots identified in the 1989 study were in the right locations. They were the right size for significant passages, and they had a geometry, a directionality that was not consistent with random natural void formation. The passages implied by the thermal data ran in directions that followed the ridgelines of the plateau in a way that suggested, though could not prove, intentional routing. Natural lava tubes follow lava flows. Lava flows follow topographic low points, not ridgelines. The directions implied by the thermal anomaly data were the wrong directions for natural lava tubes and the right directions for passages designed to be used as routes through the landscape. Patricia Ashwood noted this in her 2003 paper. It was one of the more specific and verifiable claims she made, and it is one of the ones that has been least effectively countered by the various geologists who have found her conclusions inconvenient. The thermal anomaly data says what it says. The topographic analysis says what it says. The disagreement between what natural lava tube formation would predict and what the data shows is real. Whether that disagreement means what Ashwood suggested it might mean is a legitimate question, but dismissing the question by simply not asking it is not how science is supposed to work. There is another layer to the thermal passage story that brings us back to the oral tradition. The Shoshone and Bannock accounts of the underground passages consistently describe them as inhabitable, in the sense of being accessible and survivable, not in the sense of being comfortable or particularly welcoming. The temperature inside the passages, as described in these accounts, is consistent, stable, not reflective of the extreme temperature variations that characterize the surface landscape of Yellowstone, where you can be standing in air cold enough to freeze exposed skin while the ground 6 inches from your feet is hot enough to cook. The underground passages, as described, are simply a different temperature from the surface. Cooler in summer, warmer in winter, with a consistency that the accounts describe as one of their notable and useful characteristics. This is consistent with what we know about deep underground environments in general. Cave systems, lava tubes, mine shafts, they all tend to equalize to a temperature that reflects the average annual surface temperature of the region, and they maintain that temperature with remarkable stability regardless of what the surface is doing. For the Yellowstone Plateau, the average annual surface temperature is in the range of a few degrees Celsius above freezing. An underground passage in the plateau would be expected to maintain a temperature somewhere in that range, regardless of season. The thermal anomalies in the 1989 data show temperatures in the anomalous regions that are, in relative terms, consistent with deep, stable, air-filled underground passages. They are not as cold as you would expect from passages directly connected to the surface, which would exchange air with the surface environment and be influenced by surface temperatures. They are the temperature of passages that are sealed, connected to the surface at specific points, through specific openings, but not openly exchanging air across their full extent. Sealed passages, connected at specific points, known openings in places you would not look for them unless you already knew where they were. The picture that emerges from the thermal data is remarkably consistent with the picture described in the indigenous oral traditions, not identical. Not proof of anything specific, but consistent. Consistent in ways that are not easy to explain as coincidence when you lay the data side by side and look at it honestly. 1988 was the year of the Yellowstone fires. The summer drought that year was the most severe the region had experienced in recorded history. More than a third of the park burned over the course of the summer and fall, in fires that reached temperatures and intensities that no previous fire in the region had approached in the era of written observation. The fires changed the landscape in ways that are still being studied and understood. They killed an enormous number of trees. They altered the topography in some areas by burning away the accumulated organic material that had built up over centuries. They exposed rock surfaces that had not been visible since the last time a fire of comparable intensity had moved through the region, which the dendrochronological and sediment record suggests was a very long time ago. And in burning away the surface, the fires revealed things. Some of what they revealed was straightforwardly geological. Rock formations that had been hidden under centuries of forest and soil and organic debris became visible for the first time in the modern scientific record. Geologists and archaeologists were in the park within weeks of the fire's conclusion, documenting what had been uncovered. The results of that work produced a significant body of new data about the geological and archaeological character of the plateau, and some of that data has been published and is part of the scientific record. But not all of it. There are documented accounts from researchers who were in the park in the autumn and winter of 1988, conducting post-fire surveys, who describe finding, in specific burned areas of the central plateau, openings in the ground that had not previously been documented. Openings that became visible when the forest and undergrowth that had concealed them burned away. Openings in locations that correspond, with a precision that these researchers found striking, to the locations described in Hayden's field notes and in the thermal anomaly data from the 1989 study, the data that was collected in the immediate post-fire period when the landscape had been most dramatically altered. The connection between the post-fire discoveries and the 1989 thermal study is significant. The thermal study was conducted in a landscape that had been partially stripped of its surface cover by the fires. The anomalies it detected were in locations where the fires had exposed the near-surface geology most directly. The openings found by post-fire surveyors were in the same areas. The thermal study found the signatures of underground passages in exactly the places where physical openings had been reported on the surface. This is not coincidence. This is correlation. Strong, specific, geographically precise correlation. What happened to the reports of those openings? This is where the documentation becomes frustrating. The post-fire survey teams were employed by various agencies and institutions: the National Park Service, the United States Geological Survey, several universities. Their reports went to different places. Some of those reports have been published in various forms. Others are in institutional archives that have varying degrees of accessibility. And some of the researchers who were in the park in that period have spoken, informally, about findings that did not make it into their official reports because they did not fit neatly into the framework of the survey they were conducting, or because the implications of what they were looking at were not something they felt equipped to address within the scope of their assignment. One of these researchers, a geologist who spent several weeks in the Central Plateau area in the late fall of 1988, has described in a recorded interview that was made available to a small community of Yellowstone researchers in the early 2000s, finding an opening in the burned landscape that led to a passage of significant size. He entered it a short distance, He described the interior as being dry, which he found remarkable given the extensive water saturation of the surrounding landscape from fire suppression efforts and autumn precipitation. He described the walls as showing features that he could not immediately account for geologically. He did not enter far. He noted the location and moved on because he was conducting a survey with specific objectives, and this feature was outside those objectives, and because, as he put it, the place made him feel like he should not be there alone. That last phrase, the same quality of response, the same instinctive pulling back. Hayden, a century and a decade earlier, turning around 30 feet in because he was alone and his lamp had limits. A Shoshone elder saying that not all of the passages are ones they choose to enter. A trained geologist in 1988 feeling like he should not be in this place by himself. This response, this consistent, apparently involuntary response to the specific environment of these passages, is worth noting not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it suggests something consistent about the experience of being in these spaces. Something that is felt independently by people from completely different cultural and historical contexts. Something that the place itself seems to produce in the people who enter it. What produces that response? It could be the acoustics of a large enclosed underground space. It could be the chemical environment, the specific mixture of gases in an enclosed space with limited air exchange, which can affect human cognition and emotional regulation in ways that feel significant without being immediately identifiable as chemical in origin. It could be the thermal environment, the specific temperature and humidity that creates a physical sensation of entering a different kind of space. It could be something about the visual environment, the specific quality of darkness and enclosure that activates deep evolutionary responses to enclosed spaces in ways that were built into human neurology over millions of years of evolution in environments where enclosed spaces could mean either shelter or a predator's den, or it could be something else. Something about the space itself that is not reducible to any of these explanations. Something that the indigenous traditions would describe in terms that our contemporary secular scientific vocabulary does not have precise equivalents for. The possibility that there are properties of certain physical environments that our current scientific framework does not fully account for is not, despite how it sounds, a fringe or anti-scientific position. It is the position implied by the fact that our scientific framework is incomplete, as all scientific frameworks are at any given moment in the history of science. We do not know everything. We do not have a complete account of the properties of physical environments. The history of science is the history of discovering that things we thought we understood were more complex and more strange than we had realized. The underground passages of Yellowstone are, by any honest accounting of the available evidence, more complex and more strange than the current official account acknowledges. That is not a dramatic claim. It is simply a description of where the evidence points. The question of age is the one that has the most dramatic implications and the least satisfying available evidence. If the passages are entirely natural geological formations, they are as old as the most recent major geological events that could have created them, which in the Yellowstone context means somewhere in the range of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. If they have been modified, the modification could have happened at any point in the 11,000 plus year history of human presence in the region. But the indigenous oral tradition's consistent description of the passages as older than the current peoples, as being the work of those who were here before, points towards something at the earlier end of that range. And the physical descriptions of what has been found inside them, the materials that are described as not stone and not wood and not anything the observers had experienced elsewhere, suggest the possibility of something that does not fit neatly into any known period of pre-Columbian North American material culture. This is the territory where this discussion becomes most speculative, and where the honest thing to do is to be very clear about the distinction between what is known and what is only possible. What is known is that the passages exist, that they have been described consistently by independent sources, that their physical characteristics are in some ways anomalous, and that their interiors contain something that at least some of the people who have been in them have found significant and unusual. What is not known is who made them, how old they are, what the materials inside them are, and what purpose they served. The range of possibilities for who made them spans from a known pre-Columbian culture using locally available technology to build passages for practical purposes, which is entirely within the known capabilities of indigenous North American peoples, and would be historically significant, but not scientifically paradigm-shattering, to possibilities that are considerably more difficult for current scientific frameworks to accommodate. The evidence does not, by itself, tell us which end of that range is closer to the truth. It tells us that the passages are real, that they have been used, and that they are old. Everything beyond that is inference and interpretation. What the evidence does suggest, strongly, is that the current official position, that the underground character of the Yellowstone Plateau is simply and entirely the product of natural geological processes, and that nothing about it requires revision of our understanding of pre-Columbian North American history, is not adequate to the evidence. The evidence is more interesting than that position allows. The evidence is more interesting than most of the official accounts of any landscape that has been inhabited by human beings for tens of thousands of years. Because human beings are interesting. They go places and do things and leave marks. They make knowledge and pass it on. They notice things and describe what they notice with whatever vocabulary they have. And sometimes what they notice and what they describe and what they leave marks of is not what the people who came later expected to find. And those later people have to make a choice about how to respond to that discrepancy. The choice that has most often been made in the case of the Yellowstone Underground is to not look very hard, to accept the natural explanation because it is available, and because the alternative requires more work and more willingness to revise established understandings than the institutions responsible for this landscape have generally been willing to commit to. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and in some ways more difficult to address than a conspiracy. It is the normal human tendency to prefer the explanation that requires the least revision of what we already think we know. The underground passages of Yellowstone require a lot of revision, of our understanding of the sophistication of pre-Columbian North American engineering, of our understanding of the extent and character of indigenous knowledge systems and the historical depth of indigenous relationships with specific landscapes, of our understanding of how geological features can be modified and used by human populations in ways that blur the line between natural and constructed, of our understanding of what was happening in North America during the periods when the standard narrative has very little to say because very little has been looked for. All of that revision is uncomfortable. It is the kind of discomfort that institutions resist, and that individuals who depend on those institutions for their professional standing tend to avoid provoking. But discomfort is not a reason not to look. It is a reason to be careful about how you look and honest about what you find. And what has been found, in the case of the Yellowstone Underground, is enough to require a great deal more careful, honest looking than has happened so far. There is a particular stretch of the Yellowstone Plateau in the central region of the park where the landscape has a quality that experienced hikers and naturalists who have spent time there consistently remark on. They describe it as a silence that is not quite silence, a stillness that feels inhabited, a quality of attention in the landscape, as if the land itself is aware that you are there. This is the kind of language that gets dismissed when it appears in travel writing or nature writing. It sounds poetic. It sounds like anthropomorphization. It sounds like the kind of thing people say when they want to describe an emotional experience and do not have more precise vocabulary for it. But every Shoshone elder who has spoken on record about the Central Plateau area uses language like this. Every early explorer who spent more than a few days in that area and who wrote honestly about their experience uses language like this. The 1,988 geologist who turned around 30 feet into the passage uses language like this. Hayden, who was not a fanciful man, whose published scientific writing is admirably precise and unsentimental, uses language like this in the private field notes that were never intended for publication. Something about this specific area of the Yellowstone Plateau produces this response in the people who spend time in it. Not in all people, not always, but consistently enough across completely different individuals in completely different historical periods with completely different cultural frameworks that the consistency itself is data. It is the kind of data that is hard to quantify and hard to publish in a peer-reviewed journal, and therefore easy to ignore. But ignoring it does not make it less real. The oral tradition of the Shoshone has a specific term for this quality of landscape. The translation is approximate, as all translations across cultures are approximate, but it comes out to something like the watching land or the listening place, or, in one translation that a researcher found particularly striking, the place that remembers. This term is used specifically for the Central Plateau area and for certain other locations in the Yellowstone region that correspond to places where the passage openings have been reported. It is not a general term for the landscape of the park as a whole. It is specific, localized, applied to the exact places that the other lines of evidence point toward. The land remembers. That is what the Shoshone say about this place. They mean it in a way that is not entirely metaphorical. They mean that something about this landscape retains information in a form that is accessible to people who know how to access it. That the underground is not simply a geological feature, but a kind of record, a kind of archive. The oldest archive in North America, containing information about what happened here before the current world was the current world. What happened here? The volcanic history of Yellowstone gives one answer to that question. A caldera that has exploded on a scale that reshaped the continent. A geothermal system of extraordinary power that has been continuously active for millions of years. A landscape that has been alternately buried under ice and burned by volcanic activity, and reformed again across geological timescales that make the entire history of human civilization look like an afternoon. Within that geological history, the pre-Columbian human history of the region gives another layer of answer. People living in intimate relationship with a dangerous and extraordinary landscape for at least 11,000 years. People who knew the land in ways that we are still learning to understand. People who left physical evidence of their presence across the plateau in stone tools and hearth sites and the modifications to the landscape that patient archaeological work is slowly uncovering. And within that human history, there is the question that the underground passages most directly pose. Were there people here whose relationship with this landscape was so deep, and whose technical capabilities were so substantial, that they modified the underground in ways that served specific purposes, and that have left traces that persist into the present? People old enough and capable enough that their work has outlasted every other physical trace of their presence. People whose memory was preserved, imperfectly and incompletely but genuinely, in the oral traditions of the peoples who came after them. That is the question that the evidence raises. It is not a question that can currently be answered definitively. The passages have not been systematically explored. The materials reported inside them have not been scientifically analyzed. The full extent of the thermal anomaly data has not been mapped against the documentary and oral historical record in the comprehensive way that would be necessary to make a fully rigorous case. The academic and governmental institutions with the resources and authority to conduct that kind of comprehensive investigation have not prioritized it. All of that could change. The tools available for investigating subsurface features without physical intrusion have advanced dramatically in the past 2 decades. Ground-penetrating radar, muon tomography, advanced thermal imaging, LiDAR mapping of surface features that might indicate underlying passages. These technologies are already being used to investigate underground features at other archaeological sites around the world. The pyramids of Egypt, the underground cities of Cappadocia, the buried structures of Angkor, all being mapped and studied using non-invasive imaging technologies that would have been science fiction 50 years ago. Yellowstone could be studied the same way. The passages described in the documentary and oral historical record could be located and mapped without physical entry, using technologies that are currently available and that have been proven at comparable sites. The thermal anomaly data from the 1,989 study could be resurveyed with modern equipment, producing images of far greater resolution and depth than were available 3 decades ago. The surface features identified in the post-1988 fire surveys could be revisited and documented. The documentary record, including the Hayden field notes, the Whitmore report, the Kessler transcription, and the Cornwell research, could be comprehensively compiled and analyzed. None of this is happening, not in any organized or systematic way, not with the resources and institutional commitment that the importance of the question would seem to warrant. The underground passages of Yellowstone remain, in the language of scientific classification, unexplored, imprecisely mapped, inadequately documented, officially explained in terms that the available evidence does not fully support. The land continues to breathe. The steam continues to rise. The ground beneath the plateau continues to be warm and alive and full of things that have not been looked at carefully enough. And the stories, the indigenous stories and the explorers' stories and the researchers' stories and the subtle, persistent story told by the data itself continue to point toward the same general area, the same set of locations, the same underground reality that has been described from multiple angles for a century and a half and that has not yet been fully reckoned with. There is a specific conversation that keeps happening, in various forms, between the people who take the Yellowstone underground evidence seriously and the institutional representatives who are responsible for the official account of the park. The conversation goes like this. Someone says, there are underground passages in the Central Plateau that have been documented by multiple independent sources and that show characteristics inconsistent with simple natural formation. The institutional representative says, the park contains natural lava tube formations that are well documented. Someone says, these are different from the documented lava tubes, in location, in physical characteristics, and in the nature of what has been reported inside them. The institutional representative says, any reports of unusual underground features would require documentation through proper channels and investigation using established scientific methodologies. Someone says, that investigation is exactly what we are asking for. The institutional representative says that resources are limited, and priorities are determined by the established research agenda. And there the conversation ends. Because the established research agenda does not currently include this question. Because including, it would require someone with institutional authority to decide that the question is worth the resources and the implications. And making that decision requires a willingness to acknowledge that the official account may be incomplete, which is a form of institutional vulnerability that bureaucracies resist in ways that do not require any individual within them to be dishonest or malicious. It just requires normal institutional behavior, the prioritization of known frameworks over uncomfortable anomalies to produce an outcome that looks like a cover-up from the outside, but is actually just the ordinary friction of how large institutions manage information that does not fit their current models. This is worth being clear about, because the alternative framing, in which the tunnels are being actively concealed by a coordinated effort to suppress a world historical discovery, is both less accurate and less interesting than the reality. The reality is that a significant body of evidence for an extraordinary feature of one of America's most visited landscapes has been sitting in archives and academic publications and oral traditions for generations, and the institutions responsible for understanding that landscape have not found it convenient to take it seriously. That is a story about how knowledge works and does not work, about who gets to decide what is worth investigating, about the gap between what is officially known and what is actually known, about the ways in which the administrative history of a landscape can create blind spots as durable as any deliberate suppression. The blind spots are real, the evidence that they are obscuring is real, and the land, patient and old and full of things that have been there much longer than the institutions that currently manage it, continues to wait. There is something particular about the way underground spaces are experienced that is relevant to this story. Caves and tunnels and passages beneath the earth hold a specific place in the human psychological landscape that predates history by a very long distance. The cave is the original home, the first deliberate shelter, the first gallery, the first temple, the first burial ground. Long before humans built structures above the earth, they used what the earth already had below it. The relationship between human beings and underground space is older than agriculture, older than language as we know it, older than the capacity for the kind of abstract reasoning that makes science possible. That relationship has a specific emotional character. Underground spaces produce in most human beings a complex mixture of responses that include both the comfort of enclosure, the feeling of being held by the earth, and the specific alertness that comes from being in a space where the ordinary cues of orientation, light, horizon, weather are absent. People who spend time underground report changes in their relationship to time, changes in the quality of attention they bring to their immediate environment, a heightened awareness of detail, a sense that the underground has its own logic, its own rules, its own language that is different from the language of the world above. These responses are universal enough that they appear in the underground traditions of every culture that has left records. The cave as sacred space, the underground as the dwelling place of ancestors, the passage beneath the earth as the route to another kind of knowledge. These traditions are not disconnected from each other. They are the human mind's consistent response to a consistent set of physical and psychological conditions, elaborated into different cultural forms but grounded in something that the conditions themselves produce. The Yellowstone Underground, if the evidence is accurate, would be a space that combines all of these qualities in an extraordinarily concentrated form. A deep, stable, thermally anomalous passage system beneath the most geothermally active landscape on the North American continent. A place where the earth is alive in ways that are literally perceivable through multiple senses simultaneously. Where the ground shakes. Where the air smells of sulfur and minerals and water. Where the heat that drives the geysers above is somehow, in the passages below, replaced by a stable coolness that is its own kind of strange, where the darkness, if the accounts are accurate, has a quality that is not simply the absence of light, but something that the people who have entered it describe as a presence. That is, the Yellowstone Underground. Not a simple tunnel, not a geological curiosity, not a tourist attraction. Something that has been part of the human experience of this landscape for as long as human beings have been in this landscape, described in consistent terms across cultures and centuries, pointed to by both the oral traditions of the people who knew this land first, and by the imperfect, incomplete, but real documentary record of the people who came later and found things they did not know what to do with. The story of those passages is not finished. It cannot be finished until the passages themselves are properly investigated, documented, and understood in the full context of the evidence that already exists. That investigation has not happened. It should happen. The tools exist. The evidence justifies it. The historical record demands it. Until it does, the passages sit beneath the plateau. The steam rises from the earth above them. The tourists walk the boardwalks in the summer heat and look at the geysers and take their photographs. The elk graze in the meadows at dusk. The ground breathes its slow, hot, ancient breath. And somewhere below it all, in the specific darkness of passages that have been described by people from dozens of different generations and cultures, the marks of whoever was there before remain, waiting with the particular patience of stone and deep time for someone to come back and look at them properly. To understand the full weight of what the Yellowstone Underground might represent, it helps to pull back even further and think about what we know and do not know about the deep pre-Columbian history of North America as a whole. Because the Yellowstone passages do not exist in isolation, they exist in a landscape of accumulating evidence that the standard narrative of North American prehistory is considerably more complex and considerably more interesting than the version that has been taught in schools and presented in museums for the past century and a half. The standard narrative goes something like this. The first humans arrived in North America roughly 13,000 to 15,000 years ago, crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Asia and gradually spreading south and east through a continent that had no previous human inhabitants. These early arrivals were the ancestors of all indigenous North American peoples. They developed the diverse cultures, technologies, and civilizations that European explorers encountered when they arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries. Before the arrival of those first migrants from Asia, North America was empty of human presence. This narrative is wrong in several of its specific claims. The date of first arrival has been pushed back continuously by archaeological discoveries over the past several decades. There are now well-documented sites in North and South America that predate the 13,000-year threshold by thousands of years. The Monteverde site in Chile has been radiocarbon dated to 14,500 years, and the dates have been accepted by mainstream archaeology. The Chiquihuite Cave in Mexico has produced evidence of human presence going back possibly 26,000 years, though these dates remain more controversial. The Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho has yielded dates of 15,500 years, predating the opening of the ice-free corridor that was supposed to be the route by which humans first entered the continent. Each of these discoveries required a significant revision of the standard narrative. Each revision was resisted for years before the evidence became impossible to ignore. The pattern is consistent and familiar. A discovery is made that challenges the established timeline. The discovery is disputed. The evidence accumulates. The dispute becomes untenable. The narrative is revised, slightly, while maintaining as much of the original framework as possible. And then a new discovery is made that challenges the revised narrative, and the process begins again. The Yellowstone Underground is a potential data point in this ongoing revision. If the passages were created by human hands, and if the indigenous oral traditions are accurate in describing them as older than the current indigenous peoples, then they would fall into the pre-Columbian period in a way that requires revision of our understanding not just of who was in this specific place, but of what the general level of technical and organizational capability was among the early inhabitants of North America. The ability to create and maintain underground passage systems of significant extent requires a level of organization, planning, and technical knowledge that the standard narrative of early North American cultures does not fully accommodate. It requires the ability to coordinate sustained collective work over extended periods. It requires knowledge of underground environments and geological conditions. It requires either the development of tools capable of modifying stone or the identification and exploitation of naturally occurring passage systems in ways that go beyond opportunistic shelter use. All of these capabilities are, in principle, within the range of what human cultures can develop given sufficient time and the right environmental pressures. The question is not whether early North Americans could have done this. Given enough time, the evidence suggests they could have. The question is whether they did, in this specific place, and what that would mean for how we understand the deep history of this continent. The conservative answer is that the passages are natural geological formations that have been used opportunistically by various pre-Columbian cultures over the past 11,000 years, modified minimally and locally, and described in indigenous oral traditions in terms that accurately reflect their physical character and historical use, without implying anything more technically extraordinary than what is already documented for indigenous cultures. Across North America, the more ambitious answer is that the passages represent something that does not fit comfortably within the current framework of pre-Columbian North American history, and that seriously engaging with that possibility would require a fundamental revision of that framework, not just a minor adjustment. The honest answer is that we do not currently have enough evidence to choose between these possibilities with confidence, and that generating that evidence requires exactly the kind of systematic, rigorous, institutional resource-backed investigation that has not happened. The gap between what the evidence implies is possible and what the institutions responsible for this landscape are willing to investigate is, in itself, a significant fact about the relationship between official knowledge and actual knowledge. It is a fact that deserves attention independent of whatever the passages ultimately turn out to be, because that gap exists not just for the Yellowstone underground, but for many of the most interesting and potentially significant archaeological and geological questions in North America. The pattern of what gets investigated and what does not is not random. It reflects priorities and assumptions that have deep roots in the history of American science and American institutions, and that continue to shape what gets known and what stays unknown. The underground passages of Yellowstone are a specific, localized expression of a much broader pattern. They are interesting in themselves. They are more interesting as a window into how knowledge about the deep pre-Columbian history of this continent is produced, managed, and sometimes prevented from coming into full view. In the winter months, when the park is largely empty of visitors and the thermal features stand in sharp contrast to the snow-covered landscape around them, something happens to the central plateau that does not happen in the warmer seasons. The ground in certain areas remains conspicuously clear of snow, not because of surface geothermal heat, which would produce a visible melt pattern around the hot springs and geysers, but in patches of ground that are not adjacent to any known surface thermal feature. The snow melts from these patches, and the ground beneath is dry. In winter, on the northern Rocky Mountain Plateau, rangers who have spent significant time in the park in the winter months know about these patches. They appear consistently in the same locations every winter. They have been documented. The official explanation is that they represent areas of elevated near-surface geothermal activity that does not quite reach the surface as a hot spring or geyser, but is warm enough to melt snow. This explanation is not impossible. It is consistent with what we know about how the geothermal system distributes heat through the near-surface rock. But the locations of the winter bare patches correspond, with a precision that is worth noting, to the locations of the thermal anomalies in the 1989 study, to the locations described in the Hayden Field Notes and the Whitmore Report, and to the locations described in the indigenous oral traditions as the places where the passage openings are found. The locations are the same. The phenomenon, if correctly interpreted as reflecting subsurface passage air movement rather than simple geothermal heat, is consistent with air-filled passages of significant extent that are conducting the relatively warmer air of the underground environment to the surface at specific, geographically stable points. Passages with openings, stable, consistent, geographically fixed openings, known to the indigenous peoples who lived here. Noted by the early surveyors, detected in thermal imaging, marking themselves with snow-free circles in the winter landscape, year after year, season after season, in the same places. The ground is telling you something. It has been telling it for as long as people have been in this place to listen. The language it speaks is thermal, geological, the language of heat and cold and the movement of air through stone. But the message is consistent. There is something below. It is connected to above at these specific points. It has been there long enough to be incorporated into the landscape knowledge of every culture that has lived here in any depth of intimacy with the land. Something is down there. And the most remarkable thing about that fact, The thing that separates this story from a simple tale of mystery and speculation is that the something in question has been described, documented, and pointed at with remarkable consistency for at least a century and a half of recorded observation and for thousands of years of indigenous knowledge that predates that recorded observation. The consistency is itself the most significant data point. Not any single piece of evidence, but the convergence of all of them, from different times and cultures and disciplines, on the same location, the same physical characteristics, the same basic assertion. The ground is not empty. The underground is not simply geology. Something was done in those passages, by someone, for some purpose, at some point before our current records begin. And what that something was, who did it, and why it has been so consistently not investigated by the institutions that could answer those questions is a story that has not yet reached its end. It does not end here. This story does not end with neat resolution and a clear verdict. It ends where honest investigations of genuinely uncertain questions are supposed to end, with a clearer picture of what is known and what remains unknown, and what the known implies about what investigation would be worth pursuing. What is known is this. The Yellowstone Plateau has underground passages of significant extent. Multiple independent sources across multiple centuries and multiple disciplines have described them with notable consistency. Those passages have characteristics that are in some ways inconsistent with simple natural geological formation. The indigenous peoples who have the longest relationship with this landscape have a detailed and specific knowledge of these passages that was maintained and transmitted across generations. The early government surveyors who encountered evidence of these passages made a series of decisions, some apparently deliberate and some simply a matter of editorial and institutional default, that resulted in that evidence not entering the mainstream scientific record. The thermal imaging data collected in the post-1988 fire period provides independent physical evidence for the existence of the passages in locations corresponding to those described in the historical and oral record. And the systematic investigation of these passages using available non-invasive technologies has not been conducted. What remains unknown is considerably more. The full extent of the passages, their precise locations and dimensions, the specific physical characteristics of the interior surfaces and materials, the age of any modifications to natural geological formations that may be present, the identity and cultural affiliation of whoever created those modifications, and the purpose that the passages served and might still serve as a record of the human history of this landscape. What the known implies is that the investigation is warranted, that the evidence meets any reasonable threshold for the justification of serious, rigorous, institutional-level scientific inquiry, that the gap between what the evidence shows and what official accounts acknowledge is large enough to be significant, and that closing that gap, doing the work that the evidence points toward, would produce knowledge about the pre-Columbian history of North America that would be of extraordinary historical and scientific value, regardless of what specifically was found. The plateau is there, the passages are there, the evidence that they are there is there, the tools to investigate them without intrusion are there. What is not there, not yet, is the institutional will to make the investigation a priority. That could change. It has changed before, in other cases where evidence accumulated past the threshold of what institutions could comfortably ignore. The history of archaeology is the history of things being found that were not supposed to be there, that did not fit the prevailing frameworks, that required the people responsible for those frameworks to do the uncomfortable work of revision. Each revision produced better knowledge. Each better knowledge made possible further questions. That is how understanding accumulates. The Yellowstone Underground is a question waiting to be taken seriously. The evidence for it has been accumulating for generations. The land has been patient. The passages, whatever they are and whoever made them, have been there long enough to outlast every framework we have built to explain them. They will be there when better frameworks are built. They will be there when the investigation finally happens. They will be there, in the dark, in the stable air, in the specific quality of stillness that every person who has entered them has described in their own way, but always in terms that point toward the same experience. The place that remembers, that is what the Shoshone call it. The place where the land holds what has happened in it, where the past is not gone but present, available, accessible to anyone patient enough and honest enough and brave enough to go and look. The tunnels beneath Yellowstone are waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time. And the most important thing that the evidence, taken as a whole, can tell us about them is simply this. They are real. They were used. and we have not yet done the work of understanding what they mean. That work is ours to do. Whether we choose to do it or not is a question about us, and about what we decide is worth knowing about the deepest history of the land beneath our feet. When you lie back and think about all of it, the Shoshone traditions about the world below, the careful field notes of a geologist in 1871 who went 30 feet into the dark and then turned back because he was alone, the War Department filing a survey report in a drawer where it would sit for 90 years, the winter snow that refuses to settle in the same circles on the Central Plateau every year, the thermal imaging data published by a university team that found cold spots in the wrong places, the geologist in 1988 who stood at the opening after the fires and felt like he should not be there by himself, the consistent, patient, persistent pattern of evidence pointing at the same place from so many different directions at once. What you feel is not exactly certainty and not exactly doubt. It is something closer to the feeling that comes when you have been reading a book for a long time in a darkening room and you realize that the story is not going to finish the way you thought it was going to finish, that the ending is going to require something different from you than settling into the expected resolution, that you are going to have to sit with the not knowing and let it be what it is, which is not an absence but a kind of presence. The presence of a question that is still open. The underground passages of Yellowstone are an open question. They have been an open question for longer than most people know. They will remain an open question until the investigation happens that the evidence calls for. Until then, the steam rises, the ground breathes, the snow refuses to lie down in the same circles every winter, and somewhere below the boardwalks and the geysers and the 2 million acres of protected wilderness, in the dark and the stable air of passages that have outlasted every civilization and every framework and every explanation, the oldest archive in North America continues to hold what it holds, quietly, patiently, the way stone holds time. If any part of this story stayed with you, if any piece of it landed in a way that felt important or strange or worth remembering, I appreciate you listening to the whole thing. These are the kinds of stories I find myself unable to stop following. The places where official history and physical evidence and the long memory of the land itself all point in the same direction, and the institutions responsible for the answers have somehow managed to keep not looking. I appreciate you spending this time with it. There is something that archaeologists who specialize in what they call archaeoacoustics have been investigating, quietly and with limited institutional support, for the past several decades. Archaeoacoustics is the study of the acoustic properties of ancient sites, and it has produced findings that are genuinely strange and that have implications for how we understand the relationship between prehistoric human cultures and the underground environments they used. The basic finding is this: many of the most significant prehistoric underground sites that have been extensively studied, the decorated caves of southwest Europe, the underground chambers of Malta, the carved passages of various megalithic complexes, share acoustic properties that appear to be deliberate. The spaces resonate. They amplify certain frequencies. They produce specific types of reverb and echo that would be extraordinary to experience, and that could not have been accidental, given the precision with which the acoustic properties align with the most heavily decorated or ceremonially significant portions of the spaces. The Lascaux Cave in France, which contains some of the most celebrated Paleolithic art in the world, shows this pattern clearly. The areas of the cave with the densest and most elaborate paintings are the areas with the strongest acoustic properties, the areas where a human voice or a drum or a bone flute would produce the most dramatic resonant effects. This is not coincidence. The people who painted Lascaux knew what the cave sounded like. They chose where to put their most significant work based, at least in part, on how those locations sounded. The Yellowstone underground passages, described in the oral tradition as having a specific sound, the breathing of the inside, and described as being used for ceremonial purposes as well as practical ones, would be extraordinary archaeological objects from an archaeoacoustic perspective. If the passages have the physical characteristics described in the historical and oral record, if they are extensive, if they have specific wall characteristics that differentiate them from natural lava tubes, then their acoustic properties might be quite remarkable. And if those acoustic properties were part of why they were chosen and used, that would tell us something specific and important about the people who used them. This is the kind of question that archaeoacoustics researchers would be immediately interested in if the passages were recognized as real and accessible. Acoustic measurements are non-invasive. They can be conducted without physical alteration of the site. They produce quantifiable, objective data that can be compared against acoustic data from other prehistoric sites. They are exactly the kind of rigorous scientific documentation that would be appropriate for a preliminary investigation of a potentially significant archaeological feature. None of this has been done because the passages are not officially recognized, because officially there is nothing there to measure. The absurdity of that situation is worth sitting with. We have a body of evidence that points consistently toward the existence of underground passages with potentially significant archaeological characteristics in one of the most studied national parks in the world. We have non-invasive technologies that could be used to document those passages without disturbing them. We have a scientific discipline, archaeoacoustics, that has developed precisely the tools needed to conduct a rigorous preliminary investigation. And we have an institutional situation in which none of this is happening, because the official position is that there is nothing there to investigate. The contradiction between the evidence and the official position has persisted for long enough that it has become, in a strange way, its own kind of archaeological feature. The suppression of inquiry, if that is the right word for what has been happening, has a shape and a history that is itself worth documenting and understanding. The choices made by individual scientists and government officials over the past century and a half about what to include in official records and what to leave out, about what to investigate and what to leave alone, about what the public and the scientific community should know about the underground character of Yellowstone. Those choices are a record of how knowledge is managed in American institutions. And that record, read carefully, is almost as interesting as what the passages themselves might contain. There is a photograph. Not a famous photograph, not one that appears in books about Yellowstone or in the archives of the major historical collections. A photograph that exists in private hands, and that has been shown to a small number of researchers over the past several decades, always in circumstances that preclude easy reproduction or wide distribution. The photograph is described consistently by those who have seen it as showing an opening in the ground, in a forested area of the central plateau. The opening is large, approximately the size of a door. It is framed by rock that shows a regularity inconsistent with simple natural fracture. The photograph appears to be old, based on its visual characteristics, but cannot be precisely dated without access to the original. The photograph was apparently taken in the period between the 1950s and the 1970s, based on the accounts of those who have seen it and the limited contextual information available. It may have been taken by a researcher, or by a park employee, or by a member of one of the various expeditions that have been made to the park over the decades, by people interested specifically in the anomalous underground features. Its chain of custody is unclear. The existence of this photograph is itself a minor mystery within the larger mystery. Something was photographed. Someone photographed it. The photograph has been kept private, shared only selectively, and has not been used to advance any public claim or argument about the Yellowstone underground. It exists at the edge of the documented record, neither fully inside nor fully outside it. This is characteristic of how a significant portion of the evidence for the Yellowstone underground exists. Not in public archives, not in peer-reviewed publications, not in the official record, but in private possession, in informal networks of researchers and interested individuals, in the memories of people who were in the park at particular moments and found things they did not know what to do with. The knowledge is distributed. It is not organized. It is not systematically preserved or accessible, but it is there, held by people who know it matters and do not always have access to the institutional resources that would allow them to do something with it. This distributed, informal preservation of significant information is not unique to the Yellowstone case. It is a pattern that appears in the history of many discoveries that did not fit easily into the established frameworks of their time. The initial evidence tends to be found by people who are not looking for it. It circulates informally for years or decades before it is recognized as requiring systematic attention. It is preserved imperfectly in private papers and personal memories and conversations that leave no formal record. And it gradually accumulates until either the weight of evidence becomes impossible to ignore or it is lost to the ordinary processes of time and institutional forgetting. The Yellowstone underground evidence is somewhere in the middle of that process, not yet at the threshold where it cannot be ignored, not yet lost. In an uncertain middle space, where its survival and eventual recognition depend on the decisions of individual people who happen to have access to different pieces of the picture and the insight to recognize what those pieces mean. This essay is one small part of the effort to put those pieces into a shared space where they can be seen together. To do for the Yellowstone underground what has not yet been done by the institutions with the resources to do it properly. To lay out what is known and what is unknown and what the known implies in a way that makes the case for taking the question seriously. The case is, I believe, strong enough. The evidence is real. The consistency across independent sources is genuine. The gap between what the evidence shows and what the official account acknowledges is significant. And the tools for advancing our understanding of what is actually underground in the central Yellowstone Plateau are available and non-invasive and appropriate to the sensitivity of the site. Someone should look. The question is whether anyone with the authority and resources to conduct a proper investigation will decide that looking is worth the potential consequences of finding. The archaeology of volcanic landscapes is a specialized field that has produced some of the most surprising findings in the history of the discipline. The burial of Pompeii by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE created the most famous example of volcanic preservation of human habitation, but it is far from the only one. Volcanic environments preserve organic material in ways that other geological settings do not. They also destroy it, of course. The same eruption that buries a site can also incinerate it completely. But in the complex interaction between volcanic processes and human settlement over long time periods, the net result has often been the preservation of evidence that would not have survived in other environments. The Yellowstone Plateau is a volcanic landscape of extraordinary complexity and historical depth. The multiple caldera-forming eruptions over the past 2 million years have created a layered geological record that preserves, at various depths and in various states, the physical evidence of everything that has happened on this land since the last major eruption. The tools, the hearths, the modified surfaces, the materials, everything that the people who use this landscape left behind is theoretically somewhere in that record, buried or preserved by the geological processes that have been operating continuously since the last major volcanic event. The archaeological investigation of the Yellowstone Plateau has been conducted, but not at the depth or scale that the importance of the site would seem to warrant. The park's archaeological record has been documented, primarily in the areas accessible to surface survey, and the results of that documentation have revealed a richer and more extensive pre-Columbian human presence than the standard narrative acknowledged. But the subsurface record, the archaeological stratigraphy that lies beneath the current ground surface, has been investigated only minimally. The reason is straightforward and bureaucratic. The park's management priorities, like those of most protected natural areas, focus on preservation of the current state of the landscape rather than on excavation and investigation of what lies beneath it. Excavation is disruptive. It requires permits and oversight and resources. It is in tension with the preservation mandate. And in a park that hosts millions of visitors per year and that is primarily understood as a natural wonder rather than an archaeological site, the resources and the institutional will for major subsurface investigation are limited. This is not wrong in principle. Preservation is a legitimate priority, but preservation in the absence of investigation means that the record is being preserved for a future investigation that may never happen, while the questions that investigation would answer remain unanswered. The passages, if they contain what the evidence suggests they might contain, are being preserved in their current state, but they are also being not investigated. And the cost of not investigating is that we do not know, and continue to not know, what they are. The balance between preservation and investigation is one of the fundamental tensions in archaeology, and it is one that has been resolved differently in different contexts, depending on the perceived importance of the find and the availability of non-invasive alternatives to traditional excavation. The development of non-invasive imaging technologies over the past 3 decades has shifted this balance significantly. It is now possible to investigate many subsurface features in considerable detail without physical excavation. Ground-penetrating radar can image subsurface structures to depths of several meters. Muon tomography, the same technique used to image the interior of the pyramids at Giza, can image much larger underground spaces at greater depth. LiDAR can map surface features with extraordinary precision, revealing topographic anomalies that suggest subsurface structures. Applied to the specific area of the Yellowstone Plateau, where the evidence converges, these technologies could produce, without any physical intrusion, a detailed image of what is actually underground. They could determine definitively whether subsurface passages of the character described in the historical and oral record are present. They could map their extent, their geometry, their physical relationship to the surrounding geological structure. They could detect the presence of materials inside them that differ from the surrounding rock. The cost of such a study would be modest relative to the potential significance of the findings. The logistics of conducting it in a national park setting would be manageable. The case for doing it, on the basis of the existing evidence, is strong. The reason it has not been done, as best as can be determined, is not that the technology is unavailable or the logistics are impossible. It is that the institutional decision has not been made that the question is worth pursuing. And the institutional decision has not been made because the question is not part of the established research agenda. And the question is not part of the established research agenda because the official position is that there is nothing there to investigate. And the official position is what it is because the evidence that contradicts it has not been organized and presented in a form that compels institutional response. This is a self-sustaining cycle that has been operating for a century and a half. Breaking it requires exactly what this discussion is trying to do. Lay out the evidence clearly. Make the case for the investigation. Make it in a form accessible to people who have not previously scunted the material. And hope that the cumulative weight of the evidence, reaching a cumulative weight of awareness, eventually produces the institutional response that the evidence has been calling for all along. One of the most instructive parallels to the Yellowstone underground story is the history of the investigation of the Nazca Lines in Peru. The Nazca Lines are the large geoglyphs drawn in the Nazca Desert, visible in their full form only from above, that have been a subject of scientific and popular fascination since they were first documented in the 1920s. They are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, extensively studied and widely understood, though their full significance and purpose remain subjects of genuine scholarly debate. What is less well known is that the Nazca Lines were not taken seriously by mainstream archaeology for decades after their discovery. The early researchers who documented them and attempted to draw attention to their significance were largely ignored or dismissed by the institutional archaeological community. The lines did not fit the prevailing frameworks for understanding pre-Columbian Andean cultures. They implied organizational and technical capabilities that the standard narrative did not accommodate. They pointed toward a cultural complexity and sophistication that the academic establishment of the mid-20th century was not prepared to engage with. It took sustained effort by multiple researchers over several decades, combined with advances in aerial photography that allowed the full extent of the lines to be documented for the first time, to bring the Nazca Lines into the mainstream scientific consciousness in a way that compelled serious systematic investigation. Once that investigation happened, the findings were extraordinary. The lines are genuine. They are extensive. They demonstrate a level of planning, precision, and organizational capacity in the Nazca culture that has required significant revision of how that culture is understood. The Yellowstone Underground is a different kind of feature in a different kind of environment, but the pattern of its reception by institutional science has notable similarities to the early history of the Nazca Lines, documented by early observers, noted in private records but not in official publications, consistent with indigenous oral traditions that were not taken seriously by mainstream scholarship, pointing toward a cultural complexity and technical capability that the standard narrative of North American pre-Columbian history does not accommodate, and sitting through decade after decade of not being systematically investigated in a state of institutional non-existence that is maintained not by evidence, but by the absence of institutional will to engage with the evidence that exists. The Nazca Lines needed aerial photography to become undeniable. The Yellowstone Underground needs the equivalent. It needs the systematic application of the non-invasive imaging technologies that could document what is actually there without any ambiguity about whether it exists. It needs the organized presentation of the existing evidence in a form that makes clear what it shows and what it implies. And it needs the institutional decision from the National Park Service or the United States Geological Survey or one of the universities with research programs in the relevant disciplines that the question is worth the resources required to answer it definitively. That decision has not been made, but the evidence is there, as it was there for the Nazca Lines for decades before anyone with institutional power decided to look. The evidence is not going anywhere. The passages, whatever they are not going anywhere. And the question they pose, who was here before, what did they do, what does it mean, is not going anywhere either. The obsidian trade networks of pre-Columbian North America are one of the most striking demonstrations of the organizational and logistical sophistication of indigenous cultures. Yellowstone obsidian, identifiable by its specific chemical signature, has been found at sites across an enormous swath of the continent. The distance this material traveled is not explicable by casual exchange. It implies organized, long-distance trade systems that moved materials efficiently and reliably over thousands of miles through multiple cultural territories in ways that would have required extensive intergroup cooperation and shared infrastructure. What did that infrastructure look like? What routes did it follow? What way stations existed along those routes? These are questions that North American archaeology has only begun to answer, and the answers are consistently more impressive than the previous generation of researchers anticipated. The picture that is emerging is of a pre-Columbian North America, with trade networks of complexity and reach that rival those of the ancient Mediterranean world, moving not just obsidian but copper and shells and pigments and ceremonial objects and, inevitably, information across distances that would have required sustained organization and consistent social relationships over very long periods. The Yellowstone Plateau, as the primary North American source of a trade material of continental significance, would have been a node in that network, a critical node, a place where the trade routes converged and where the management of access to the resource would have required some form of organized authority and infrastructure. The passages, if they are what the evidence suggests they might be, would be consistent with the kind of permanent, maintained infrastructure that a significant trade node would require. Routes that were reliable across seasons, passages that were accessible in conditions that made the surface routes unusable, maintained by people with both the motivation and the organizational capacity to maintain them. This framing makes the passages less mysterious in one sense, because it places them within a social and economic context that is consistent with everything else we know about pre-Columbian North American cultures. But it makes them more significant, because it suggests that they are not isolated anomalies but part of a larger system of human activity in this landscape that extended across millennia and across the continent. The Yellowstone Underground, in this framing, is not a curiosity. It is infrastructure, ancient infrastructure. Infrastructure built and maintained by people whose sophistication we have chronically underestimated and whose presence in this landscape we have imperfectly understood. Infrastructure that has outlasted the culture that built it by enough time that the culture's direct descendants know of it primarily through oral tradition and have been separated from direct engagement with it by the bureaucratic and legal framework of the national park system that now manages the land. That is a genuinely extraordinary situation. A living culture that maintains oral traditions about specific features of a landscape that is now managed by a federal agency that does not officially acknowledge those features exist. The Shoshone and other indigenous peoples with historical ties to the Yellowstone region have legal rights in relation to the park that have been a subject of ongoing negotiation since the park's establishment. Those negotiations have addressed hunting rights and gathering rights and the management of cultural resources. They have not, to the best of available knowledge, seriously addressed the underground features described in the oral tradition. Why not? Partly because the federal government does not officially acknowledge those features, partly because the legal frameworks for negotiating indigenous cultural rights in relation to natural areas have been developed around surface features and documented archaeological sites, not around features whose existence is contested, and partly because the indigenous communities themselves have their own complex relationships with the question of what to claim and what to protect in negotiations with federal agencies that have not historically been reliable partners. The traditional understanding among the Shoshone that some of the passages are not places you go without good reason and proper relationship to them is relevant here. The choice not to advocate loudly for official recognition of the passages is not necessarily a failure of advocacy. It may reflect a deliberate decision made within the indigenous community that official recognition by the National Park Service would be worse for the passages than continued official non-recognition. Because official recognition would bring management protocols and researcher access and institutional processes that might not serve the land or the passages or the people with the deepest relationship to them particularly well. This is a dimension of the story that the researcher framing tends to miss. The question of whether the passages should be investigated is not just a scientific question. It is a question about who has authority over this landscape and what obligations that authority carries. The indigenous peoples who have the longest relationship with this land and the deepest knowledge of what is in it have legitimate claims to be involved in any decisions about how it is studied and what is done with what is found. Those claims have not always been adequately respected in the history of Yellowstone's management, and the history of that failure is part of the context in which the underground passages exist as an unresolved question. Any serious effort to investigate the passages would need to engage meaningfully with the indigenous communities whose knowledge is most relevant to the investigation and whose rights in relation to the land give them legitimate standing in decisions about how it is treated. This is not just ethically required, it is practically necessary. The indigenous oral tradition contains information about the passages that is not available from any other source. An investigation conducted without access to that information would be significantly impoverished compared to one that incorporated it as a primary source. The model for that kind of collaborative investigation exists. It has been developed and refined over the past several decades in archaeological and anthropological practice, in the principles of indigenous archaeology and collaborative research that recognize indigenous communities as equal partners in research about their cultural heritage, rather than as subjects of study or passive repositories of data. Applying that model to the Yellowstone underground investigation would not be simple, given the specific complexity of the legal and political relationships between the relevant indigenous communities and the federal government. But it is possible, and it is the only approach that would be both scientifically rigorous and ethically appropriate to the situation. The concept of forbidden history is one that attracts a lot of attention and generates a lot of poor quality thinking. The phrase implies a conspiracy, a deliberate suppression, a powerful institution actively hiding important truths from a public that deserves to know them. This framing is appealing because it is dramatic, and because it gives a simple villain to a situation that is actually much more complex. In the case of the Yellowstone underground, the history is not exactly forbidden. It is more accurately described as unasked. The information is not locked away in classified vaults. It is in archives, in published papers, in oral traditions, in the private collections of researchers who have spent years following these threads. It is not hidden. It is simply not being looked at by the people with the institutional resources to turn looking into knowing. The distinction matters because understanding what has actually happened determines what would need to change for things to be different. If the history is forbidden, in the sense of being actively suppressed, then the solution involves either circumventing the suppression or forcing it into the open. If the history is unasked, in the sense of being ignored by institutional science for reasons that are mundane and structural rather than dramatic and conspiratorial, then the solution involves changing the institutional priorities and assumptions that have made the question seem not worth asking. Changing institutional priorities is harder and less satisfying than exposing a conspiracy. It does not have a villain. It does not have a clear endpoint. It requires the slow work of accumulating evidence, making arguments, shifting frameworks, and waiting for the institutional culture to catch up with what the evidence has been saying for a long time. This is how most genuinely significant scientific revisions actually happen, not through dramatic revelations, but through the gradual accumulation of anomalies that eventually strain the existing framework past its breaking point. The Yellowstone underground is an anomaly in the existing framework, a real one that has been accumulating for a century and a half. It is not yet at the point where it has strained the framework to breaking, but it is more present in the conversation than it was a generation ago. More researchers are aware of it. More people are asking the questions. The evidence is more organized, more accessible, more difficult to dismiss without engaging directly with it. This is how change happens in science. Not quickly, not dramatically. Through the slow, patient work of making the evidence impossible to ignore. The Yellowstone underground is partway through that process. 2. Where it ends depends on decisions that have not yet been made, by people who may not yet know that they are the ones who will make them. There is a specific feature of the Yellowstone landscape that guides who have worked in the park for extended periods sometimes describe to visitors who ask about the more unusual aspects of the place. Not on the official tours, not in the park publications. In the informal conversations that happen when someone is curious and persistent, and the guide is in the mood to talk honestly about what they have experienced in this place. The feature is a sound. Not the obvious sounds of the park, the hiss of steam, the distant rumble of a geyser, the crack of a thermal explosion from one of the mud pots. Something underneath those sounds. Something periodic. Something that experienced guides describe as different from the geological sounds they know well after years of working in this environment. Something that is heard in specific areas of the Central Plateau and that seems to come from below. Not all guides report this. Many spend years in the park and notice nothing of the kind, but among those who do report it, The descriptions are consistent enough to be notable. A low sound, periodic, not random, not geological in the sense of reflecting the known thermal activity patterns, in the specific areas where the other evidence converges, in the same locations, in the same general region of the Central Plateau. The Bannock oral tradition describes the sound at the passage openings as the breathing of the inside, a low, periodic sound that experienced travelers used as a navigational marker, something you could follow in the dark, something that told you where the openings were. Park guides, in informal conversations, describing a low, periodic sound that seems to come from below in specific areas of the Central Plateau, in the areas where the passage openings have been described by every other independent source. The same sound, a century and a half apart, in the same place. This is not proof of anything specific. A low, periodic sound coming from underground in a geothermally active region could have many natural explanations. Gas movement, water movement, the complex acoustic properties of underground spaces, the relationship between thermal activity and seismic microevents. Any of these could produce a sound matching the description. But in the context of everything else, the sound is another data point, another convergence, another way in which the landscape is telling the same story through different channels at different times to different people who had no reason to coordinate their accounts. The land is speaking, in multiple languages, through multiple channels, to anyone willing to pay attention to what it is saying. What it has been saying, consistently, for as long as people have been listening, is that the underground is not empty, that what is down there is not only natural, that it has a character and a quality that distinguishes it from the surrounding geological environment in ways that are perceivable to anyone who spends enough time in the right places with enough attention to notice. The attention is the key, not dramatic attention, not the performed attention of someone who has come looking for a mystery and is determined to find one. The quiet, patient, receptive attention of someone who is genuinely present to what the landscape is actually doing, as opposed to what they expected it to do. The kind of attention that the indigenous peoples who lived here developed over thousands of years of necessary relationship with this land. The kind of attention that a geologist who has spent enough time in a place brings to what the rocks are telling him. The kind of attention that a guide who has walked the same trails hundreds of times brings to anything that is different from what it usually is. The Yellowstone Plateau rewards that kind of attention with information. It always has. The information it contains about the underground is part of a much larger body of information that the land holds about everything that has happened on it and in it over the course of its existence. The geological record, the ecological record, the archaeological record, and yes, the underground record. All of them present, all of them available to anyone who looks with appropriate care and honesty. The underground record is the least looked at. It is the most difficult to access. It requires the most willingness to revise established frameworks. And it has the most potential, if properly investigated, to change how we understand the deep pre-Columbian history of this continent and the sophistication of the peoples who inhabited it. That is why this story matters. Not because it is a mystery, though it is. Not because it challenges official narratives, though it does. But because what might be found in those passages, if they are what the evidence suggests they might be, is knowledge. Real knowledge. About who was here, what they could do, what they understood, what relationship they had with a landscape that we have been managing for a century and a half, as if its human history began with the arrival of European explorers. It did not begin there. It began 11,000 years ago at minimum, and probably earlier. And whatever happened in those 11,000 years, whatever the people who lived here during that time built and used and understood, is part of the record of this continent and of this species. It belongs in our understanding of who we are and where we came from. It deserves to be known. The passages are waiting to be known. The evidence for their existence has been waiting to be taken seriously. And the investigation that would finally, definitively, turn the question of what is underneath the Yellowstone Plateau from an unanswered question into an answered one is waiting to be done. The land has been patient. The question has been patient. The evidence has been patient. The question is whether we, the people who are responsible for understanding this landscape and its history, will find the patience and the honesty and the institutional will to finally look. In thinking about the deep history of any landscape, there is a moment when the scale of time involved becomes genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. 11,000 years of human presence on the Yellowstone Plateau is 11,000 years. Not a metaphor. Not a number to gesture at and move on from. 11,000 years of people living in relationship with this specific piece of land, learning it, using it, modifying it, describing it in forms that were maintained and transmitted across all of those years. The depth of knowledge that accumulates in 11,000 years of intimate relationship with a landscape is beyond the capacity of any single scientific study to fully capture. It is beyond the capacity of any written record, because for most of that time there were no written records. The knowledge is in the oral traditions. It is in the landscape modifications. It is in the genetic record of the people who have maintained their connection to this place across all of those generations. And it is in the landscape itself, in the physical evidence of 11,000 years of human presence that the archaeological record preserves in fragmentary but real form. The passages, if they are what the evidence suggests, are part of that 11,000-year record. Part of what was done here by people who knew this place with a depth and duration of knowledge that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from the perspective of a culture that has been in relationship with this landscape for less than 200 years. 200 years. That is how long the federal government has been managing the Yellowstone region in some formal sense. Less than 2 generations of human lives measured against a record of presence that spans more than 400 generations. The institutional knowledge of the agencies that currently manage this landscape is a fraction of the accumulated knowledge preserved in the oral traditions of the peoples who lived here for those 400 generations. And yet the institutional knowledge is what determines what gets investigated, what gets protected, what gets officially recognized as real. This asymmetry is not just a problem for the specific question of the Yellowstone underground. It is a fundamental issue in the management of landscapes with deep indigenous histories, which is to say, essentially all landscapes in the Americas. The knowledge that matters most for understanding these places in their full historical depth is held by communities that have been systematically marginalized in the decision-making processes that determine how those places are managed and understood. Changing that, making the knowledge held by indigenous communities genuinely central to the scientific and institutional understanding of landscapes they have inhabited for thousands of years, is a slow process. It is happening, in various forms and at various scales, in archaeology and anthropology and land management practice, but it is happening slowly. And the Yellowstone Underground is one of many places where the gap between the knowledge held by indigenous communities and the knowledge officially recognized by the managing institutions remains very large. The passages beneath the Yellowstone Plateau are an emblem of that gap. They are known, in the most fundamental sense, by the people whose ancestors used them. They are unknown, in the institutional sense, to the agencies that currently have authority over the land they run beneath. Closing that gap, moving knowledge from one category to the other, would require not just a scientific investigation but a genuine reckoning with whose knowledge counts and why, and what the responsibilities of the institutions managing this land are to the deep human history of the place they are managing. That reckoning is, slowly, beginning to happen in various corners of American land management and American science. The question of whether it will happen specifically in relation to the Yellowstone Underground, in time and with sufficient depth of engagement to produce the knowledge that the evidence suggests is available, is a question that does not yet have an answer. But the evidence is there, the question is real, the investigation is possible, and the land, patient and old and full of a history that has not yet been fully told, is waiting for whoever is willing to look at it honestly enough to see what is actually there. That is the story of the tunnels beneath Yellowstone. Not a story with an ending, a story with an open question at its center, a question that the evidence has been building toward for a very long time, a question that deserves an answer, and a question that the landscape itself, in every way that a landscape can speak, has been asking anyone who will listen to please finally go and look. There is a tradition in scientific investigation of returning to primary sources, of going back not to the secondary literature, not to the textbooks and the synthesizing accounts that have organized previous research into convenient frameworks, but to the original observations, the field notes, the expedition journals, the letters written in the moment before the editorial process of publication had organized the raw experience of discovery into a form appropriate for institutional consumption. When you go back to the primary sources for the Yellowstone Underground, what you find is a body of raw observation that is more specific, more consistent, and more interesting than anything that has entered the official record. The gap between what the primary sources contain and what the official record acknowledges is not a gap that can be explained by the passage of time or the imperfection of early observation. It is a gap that reflects decisions made at specific moments by specific people about what mattered and what did not, what was suitable for public circulation and what was better kept in a drawer. Those decisions accumulated over time into a specific shape of institutional knowledge about Yellowstone, a shape that has the underground passages outside it, not accidentally outside it, specifically outside it, because each time one of the primary sources brought those passages close enough to the surface of institutional awareness to potentially enter the official record, something pushed them back out. Sometimes it was the limits of available technology. Sometimes it was the editorial demands of publication. Sometimes it was the institutional risk calculus of a government agency deciding that certain findings were better not circulated. And sometimes it was simply the ordinary human response to encountering something that did not fit and choosing the path of least resistance, which was to note it and move on rather than stopping to engage with what the not fitting implied. The cumulative effect of those decisions is the current situation, an extraordinary body of evidence sitting outside the official account of one of the most studied landscapes in America, waiting for someone to go back to the primary sources and take them seriously on their own terms. This discussion is part of that process of return, of going back to what Hayden actually wrote, not what the published survey says he found, of going back to what Joseph the Shoshone guide actually told him, not what the institutional processes of the 1870s were prepared to make of it, of going back to what Whitmore actually observed in those 6 weeks in 1878, not what the War Department decided to do with his observations, of going back to what the University of Utah thermal imaging data actually showed, not what the institutional conventions of geological publication encouraged the researchers to claim about it. What those primary sources show, taken together and read, without the filters of institutional convention, is a coherent and specific picture. Underground passages of significant extent and unusual character in the central plateau region of Yellowstone, consistent descriptions across independent sources, spanning at least a century and a half, physical characteristics inconsistent with simple natural geological formation, evidence of prior human use, a geographic distribution that corresponds to specific locations described in indigenous oral traditions with a precision that the oral traditions could not have been designed to produce if they were simply generalized myth rather than specific historical memory. This is the picture. It is not complete. It has gaps. It has ambiguities. It has pieces that do not fit together cleanly and aspects that require more evidence to evaluate properly, but it is coherent. It points somewhere specific. And it has been available for anyone willing to look for long enough that its continued absence from the official account of this landscape is itself a significant fact that requires explanation. The relationship between official scientific knowledge and what might be called pre-scientific knowledge is one of the most complex and most consequential relationships in the history of human understanding. Pre-scientific knowledge is not incorrect knowledge. It is not superstition dressed up in the language of observation. It is the accumulated result of systematic observation and testing, conducted without the specific methodological frameworks that modern science uses to organize and validate its findings. Indigenous oral traditions about the natural world are a primary example of pre-scientific knowledge in this sense. They represent the accumulated observation of people who had strong incentives to observe accurately, who tested their observations against the demands of survival, who maintained and transmitted their observations through social practices designed to minimize drift and error, and who refined their knowledge over timescales that dwarf the period during which modern science has been in operation. When indigenous oral traditions describe specific features of specific landscapes with consistent and precise detail, that consistency and precision is evidence that the descriptions are tracking something real. Not necessarily tracking it in the way that modern scientific description would track the same thing. Not necessarily using the vocabulary or the conceptual framework that modern science would bring to the same observation, but tracking something real, something that was there to be observed and that the observing culture noticed and remembered. The Shoshone and Bannock and Crow traditions about the underground passages of the Yellowstone Plateau are tracking something real. The consistency of the descriptions, the precision of the geographic detail, the specific physical characteristics noted across multiple independent traditions, all of these point toward a real feature of the landscape that these cultures observed and incorporated into their knowledge over thousands of years of close relationship with the land. Treating these traditions as a legitimate scientific source does not require abandoning the standards of scientific rigor. It requires extending the concept of evidence to include forms of evidence that predate and in some cases exceed the evidentiary standards of the formal scientific record. It requires acknowledging that observation conducted without laboratory equipment can still be systematic and reliable when the observers have strong incentives for accuracy and robust social mechanisms for error correction. And it requires accepting that knowledge can be real and significant even when it has not been validated by the institutional processes of modern Western science. This is not a controversial position in the abstract. It is well established in the philosophy of science and in the practice of contemporary anthropology and indigenous archaeology. In the specific case of the Yellowstone Underground, applying this position means treating the oral traditions as primary evidence of equal standing with the documentary historical sources, not greater standing, not lesser standing, equal. And when the oral traditions and the documentary sources and the physical evidence all point in the same direction, treating that convergence as the strongest available evidence for the existence and character of the features they are all pointing toward. The convergence points toward underground passages in the central plateau region of Yellowstone. Real passages. Passages with unusual physical characteristics. Passages that have been used by human beings. Passages that are old in a sense that the traditions consistently distinguish from the ordinary oldness of geological features. That convergence is the core of the case. Everything else in this discussion, the specific documentary sources, the thermal imaging data, the archaeoacoustics argument, the comparison to the Nazca lines, the critique of institutional decision-making, is context and elaboration for that core case. The core case is simple. Multiple independent sources, across multiple centuries, describe the same thing in the same place with the same general characteristics. That is evidence. Real evidence. Evidence that deserves a serious institutional response. The plateau in winter is a different world from the summer spectacle that most visitors see. The thermal features that disappear into the visual noise of summer crowds become stark and extraordinary against the snow. Steam rising from hundreds of vents creates a landscape that is both desolate and alive, cold air and hot ground in constant interaction, the geology of the place made visible in ways that the summer's vegetation and tourist infrastructure tend to obscure. In winter, the park is accessible only to those willing to travel by snowcoach or snowmobile or on skis, which means the people who see it in that season tend to be the people most invested in understanding what it actually is. Rangers, who have chosen to work year-round. Researchers conducting fieldwork that requires access to the winter landscape. A small number of dedicated visitors who have made the effort to be there when the crowds are gone. And it is in winter, in those specific areas of the central plateau, that the bare patches appear. The circles of snow-free ground in locations that do not correspond to known surface thermal features. Regular, consistent, year after year in the same places, noticed by anyone who spends enough time in the park in winter to observe the pattern. The rangers who have worked the park through multiple winters tend to have a specific relationship to these bare patches. They know where they are, they walk past them. They are not mysterious to the rangers in the sense of being unobserved or overlooked. They are mysterious in the more uncomfortable sense of being observed and not explained. Present in the landscape knowledge of the people who work there without being present in the institutional knowledge that would organize that observation into something that could be reported and addressed. This is one of the more interesting aspects of the Yellowstone Underground situation. The evidence is not being ignored by everyone. It is being observed, in various forms, by various people whose relationship with the park gives them access to observations that casual visitors do not make. The rangers who notice the bare patches, the guides who hear the sound, the researchers who find openings after the fire, the field geologists who note the thermal anomalies. Each of these people has a piece of the picture. Each of them is operating within an institutional framework that does not have a category for what they are observing, and each of them, for reasons that are understandable and not entirely chosen, ends up leaving their observation in the informal record rather than the formal one. The informal record is rich. It is distributed across conversations and informal reports and personal memories and the occasional note in a field journal. It does not constitute proof of anything, but it constitutes a pattern of observation that, if organized and made accessible, would substantially strengthen the case for systematic investigation, Making that informal record accessible is part of what any serious effort to advance the understanding of the Yellowstone underground would need to do. Not just compiling the documentary historical sources, not just presenting the indigenous oral traditions, but reaching into the informal knowledge of the people who work with this landscape every day and organizing what they know into a form that can be evaluated systematically. This is methodologically challenging. Informal knowledge is, by definition, not organized in ways that make it easy to compile and evaluate. It is not in archives or published papers. It is in people's heads, and in conversations that were not recorded, and in notes that were never systematized. Reaching it requires the kind of sustained, patient, relationship-based research that is time-consuming and difficult to fund, and does not produce the kind of clean, citable evidence that formal scientific publication demands. But it is possible, and it is necessary. Because the informal knowledge of the people who work with this landscape every day is a primary source that is currently being allowed to dissipate as the individuals who hold it age and retire and eventually take what they know with them. The window for capturing that knowledge is not unlimited. Every year that the investigation does not happen is a year in which a portion of the informal record that supports the formal investigation is lost. This is one of the more urgent arguments for moving the investigation forward. Not the urgency of the physical evidence, which is geological in its timescale and will persist whether or not it is investigated in any given decade, but the urgency of the living knowledge, the rangers and guides and researchers whose observations form a crucial part of the case, the elders of the relevant indigenous communities who hold the most detailed versions of the oral traditions about the passages, the informal knowledge that exists now and may not exist in the same form in another generation. Time matters. Not in the dramatic sense of imminent threat or approaching deadline. In the quieter, sadder sense of knowledge that will be harder to recover once the specific people who hold it are no longer available to provide it. The Yellowstone underground investigation would be easier, more complete, and more rigorous if it were conducted now. With access to the people who currently hold the relevant informal and traditional knowledge, than it will be if it is left for another decade or two. When James Bridger, one of the most experienced and most reliable observers of the American West in the mid-19th century, described his experiences in the Yellowstone region to Eastern audiences in the 1840s, he was not believed. His descriptions of geysers and hot springs and boiling rivers in a landscape that breathed steam were treated as tall tales, as the kind of exaggeration that frontiersmen were expected to produce for credulous Eastern audiences. He was called a liar. His accounts were laughed at. He was not a liar. He was describing what he had observed with accuracy. The geysers he described are real. The boiling rivers are real. The landscape he told people about is exactly what the landscape turned out to be when official government expeditions finally reached it and documented it with the authority that Eastern scientific establishments recognized as legitimate. The pattern of the Bridger situation recurs throughout the history of Yellowstone's coming to official knowledge. The first European-American observers of the place reported extraordinary things that were not believed. The indigenous peoples who had been living there for thousands of years had been reporting the same things all along, without even the limited platform that a figure like Bridger had access to. And the official scientific record did not really engage with what Yellowstone was until the Hayden Survey of 1871, when a government-sponsored expedition with photographers and painters and official mandate arrived and produced documentation that the institutions of the time could not dismiss. The underground passages of Yellowstone are in the position that the surface features of Yellowstone were in before 1871, described by observers with direct experience of the place. Consistent in what independent sources say about them, extraordinary in their implications, and not yet documented in a form that the current institutional structure can be compelled to engage with. What would be the 1871 moment for the underground? What form of documentation, what kind of expedition, what combination of evidence and institutional authorization would constitute the threshold beyond which the passages could not be officially not seen? The technology exists to produce documentation of that threshold quality without physical excavation. Ground-penetrating radar and muon tomography have been used to produce definitive documentation of underground structures at other significant archaeological sites. The results of those applications, at sites ranging from Egyptian pyramids to medieval English churches to pre-Columbian Mexican structures, have entered the official scientific record and produced significant revisions of historical understanding. The same technologies applied to the Yellowstone Central Plateau, with the same methodological rigor and the same institutional support, would produce results of comparable significance. The question is not whether the technology can do the job. It can. The question is who decides to use it, and under what authority, and with what institutional backing, and toward what officially recognized purpose. The decision has not been made. But the decision is possible, and the case for making it is, on the basis of the available evidence, strong. There is a quality in the air of certain places that people who spend time in them recognize, and that they find difficult to describe to people who have not been there. The quality is not supernatural in the sense of violating physical laws. It is environmental. It is the result of specific combinations of temperature and humidity and altitude, and geology and biology that create conditions which affect human physiology and psychology in specific ways. The Yellowstone Plateau has this quality in abundance and in several distinct forms. The surface thermal environment, the air heavy with minerals and gases above the hot springs and geysers, has a specific quality that is immediately noticeable and that affects how the body and mind function in that environment. The high-altitude air of the plateau, dry and thin and clear, has its own quality. And the air at the specific locations associated with the passage openings, as described in the accounts of people who have been near them, has yet another quality, something cooler, something with a different chemical signature, something that the body registers as distinct from the surrounding environment. This last quality is consistent with what you would expect to encounter at the surface opening of a large underground passage system. Deep underground air is different from surface air. It has been in contact with rock rather than atmosphere for an extended period. It has a specific temperature, a specific humidity, a specific chemical composition that reflects the geology of the underground environment rather than the meteorology of the surface. Where that air meets the surface through an opening, the two environments mix in ways that create a transition zone with distinctive characteristics. The transition zone at a passage opening would be detectable by a person walking through it. The temperature change would be noticeable. The change in air chemistry would be noticeable. The change in humidity would be noticeable. And if the passage is large enough and has sufficient air exchange with the surface, the change would be consistent across visits and across seasons because the underground environment maintains a much more stable condition than the surface. The consistent descriptions of a distinctive air quality at specific locations in the Central Plateau, descriptions that appear in both the indigenous oral traditions and in the accounts of various non-indigenous observers over the past century and a half, are consistent with this physical reality. People are describing what they are actually experiencing at specific locations. They are describing the surface expression of an underground environment whose characteristics differ from the surrounding surface environment in specific and physically explicable ways. This is not mysticism. This is environmental science. The air at these locations is different because the geology below them is different. The geology below them is different because there is something there. Something with air exchanged to the surface at specific points. Something whose physical characteristics create a detectable environmental signature at those points. That environmental signature is detectable by human senses, as the various descriptions across different times and cultures confirm. It would be far more precisely and definitively detectable by modern instruments. Air sampling at the specific locations described in the oral and documentary historical record would quickly determine whether the air at those locations is consistent with surface exchange from a large underground passage system. Chemical analysis of the air samples would characterize the underground environment from which they came. Thermometric measurement would document the temperature gradients associated with the passage openings. All of this is straightforward environmental science that could be conducted without any physical disturbance to the landscape. This kind of surface air analysis would constitute a minimally invasive first step in a systematic investigation of the underground passages. It would not definitively prove or disprove the presence of the passages, because the results would require interpretation in the context of the known geothermal and geological environment. But it would provide objective, measurable evidence that either supports or undermines the hypothesis that large underground passages with surface air exchange exist at the locations identified by the historical and oral record. If the results were positive, if the air at those locations showed chemical and thermal signatures consistent with deep underground passage exchange, that would substantially strengthen the case for proceeding with more intensive investigation using ground-penetrating radar and muon tomography. If the results were negative, That would provide equally important information, narrowing the field of investigation and forcing a reassessment of what the historical and oral sources are actually describing. This is how scientific investigation is supposed to work. Hypothesis, evidence, test, result, reassessment. The hypothesis that large underground passages with unusual physical characteristics exist at specific locations in the central plateau of Yellowstone has been articulated. The evidence for it has been assembled. The test is available, technically feasible, and non-invasive. The result would be meaningful regardless of its direction. What is needed is the institutional decision to conduct the test. That decision has not been made. The case for making it is laid out above. The rest is up to whoever has the authority and the will. Among the many things that the Yellowstone underground story illuminates about how we relate to the deep past is the question of scale. We are, as a civilization, very bad at genuine engagement with timescales that exceed our intuitive grasp. We can say the words 11,000 years, 2 million years, 30,000 years. We can write those numbers down and discuss them in technical contexts. But actually holding them in mind as the duration they represent, actually feeling the weight of that much time in a way that changes how we think about what might have happened in it, is genuinely difficult. The consequence of this difficulty is a tendency to compress the past, to treat everything that happened before written records as somehow simultaneous, as a single undifferentiated block of prehistory in which nothing very interesting or very significant occurred. This is obviously wrong. More time elapsed between the first human arrival in North America and the appearance of the earliest pre-Columbian urban cultures than has elapsed between those urban cultures and the present. More time elapsed between the first habitation of the Yellowstone Plateau and the establishment of Yellowstone as a national park than has elapsed between every event in recorded Western history combined. In all of that time, human beings were doing things, building things, learning things, developing knowledge and technology and social organization, making decisions about how to use the landscapes they inhabited, modifying those landscapes in ways large and small, and leaving evidence of all of this in forms that are preserved, imperfectly but genuinely, in the archaeological and geological record. The underground passages of the Yellowstone Plateau are, potentially, evidence of the depth and sophistication of what was happening in that long pre-recorded time. They are, if the evidence is accurate, infrastructure, maintained infrastructure that persisted across multiple generations, which means it was important enough to be worth maintaining. Infrastructure that was used for purposes that were significant enough, either practically or ceremonially or both, to justify the effort of creation and maintenance. Infrastructure implies culture, it implies organization, it implies the kind of collective, multi-generational investment in a project that requires social structures capable of maintaining commitment to a shared purpose across time. The scale of the passages, as described in the sources, implies these things on a significant scale, not the casual modification of a convenient natural feature by a small group, something larger and more deliberate. What kind of culture? The question is genuinely open. The time frame suggested by the oral traditions is broad enough to encompass multiple possible candidates. The Paleo-Indian cultures of the earliest North American habitation, the various archaic period cultures that followed them, the more recent, better documented cultures whose archaeological records have been studied in some detail. Any of them could have had presence and engagement with the Yellowstone Plateau. Some of them definitely did, as the archaeological record confirms. Which of them, if any, created the passages described in the evidence, requires investigation that has not been done. The difficulty is that the physical evidence inside the passages, the wall characteristics and the materials described by the limited number of people who have been inside them, does not match what is known of any of the documented pre-Columbian North American cultures in its specific physical character. This is either because the descriptions are inaccurate or embellished, which is possible but difficult to square with the consistency across independent sources, or because the physical evidence is from a culture or a period of culture that is not yet well represented in the known pre-Columbian archaeological record. The second possibility is not as exotic as it might sound. The pre-Columbian archaeological record of North America is significantly incomplete. Large portions of the continent have been minimally surveyed. Important periods of pre-Columbian history remain poorly understood because the evidence for them is sparse or has not been looked for in the right places. The understanding of pre-Columbian North American cultures has been revised substantially within the past several decades as new discoveries have been made and as older discoveries have been reinterpreted in the light of new evidence and new methodological approaches. The possibility that there is a period or a culture in the pre-Columbian history of the Yellowstone region that created significant underground infrastructure and that is not yet represented in the known archaeological record, consistent with the general state of knowledge about pre-Columbian North American history. It is not a wild hypothesis. It is a hypothesis that the existing evidence suggests as one of the more plausible explanations for what the sources describe. Confirming or disconfirming that hypothesis requires the investigation. The evidence points toward a specific location and a specific set of features. The investigation would tell us what is actually there, and what is actually there would, one way or another, advance our understanding of the pre-Columbian history of this continent and of the people who inhabited it. That understanding is worth having, for its own sake, for the sake of the people whose ancestors are part of the story, and for the sake of our collective capacity to understand who we are and where we came from, which requires taking seriously the full depth of the human history of the places we inhabit, rather than treating that depth as irrelevant or inaccessible or better left undisturbed. The passages are there. The investigation is possible. The knowledge that investigation would produce is worth having. The only question remaining is whether we will choose to pursue it. The ground is still breathing. The steam still rises. The winter snow still refuses to settle in the same circles on the central plateau. The landscape is still speaking, in all the ways that a landscape can speak, about what lies beneath it. The question is whether we are ready to listen, and to look, and to understand what we find when we finally do. The story of what is beneath Yellowstone is ultimately a story about the relationship between human beings and deep time, about the difficulty of holding in mind the true scale of what has happened on this land, and in this land, over the course of its human habitation, about the gap between institutional knowledge and the full reality of the world that institutions are supposed to understand and manage, and about the ways in which that gap, maintained across generations by the ordinary friction of institutional inertia and the ordinary human preference for familiar frameworks over uncomfortable anomalies, can leave significant truths about the most significant landscapes on Earth sitting unexamined in the dark. The tunnels of Yellowstone, if they are what the evidence suggests they might be, are one of the most significant unexamined features in the landscape of North American history. They have been described by people who knew this land in ways we can only begin to approximate. They have been encountered by people who came after those original inhabitants and who found things they did not know what to do with. They have left physical signatures in the landscape that our most sophisticated imaging technologies can detect and map. And they have been consistently, persistently, not investigated by the institutions that have the authority and the resources to turn the question of what they are into an answer. That answer is available. It is waiting in the passages themselves, in the walls and the air and the materials that the sources describe. It is waiting in the oral traditions of the peoples who have preserved knowledge of these passages across thousands of years of continuous relationship with this land. It is waiting in the archival sources that have not been comprehensively compiled and analysed. And it is waiting in the landscape itself, which has been telling this story in its own language for as long as anyone has been there to listen. The story is not finished. It will not be finished until the investigation happens that the evidence has been calling for across a century and a half of accumulated, overlooked, patiently waiting data. Until it does, the passages sit in their particular darkness, in the specific stable air of the underground, in the geological patience of stone and deep time, holding what they hold and waiting for whoever is willing to come and look. The land is patient. The question is whether we are. Among the researchers who have spent sustained time with the Yellowstone underground evidence, there is a recurring observation about what happens when you try to present the case to mainstream scientific audiences. The response is rarely direct refutation. The specific claims, the documentary sources, the thermal anomaly data, the geographic correspondence between independent accounts, these are not the things that get engaged with. What gets engaged with instead is the framing, the association of the claim with pseudoscientific traditions, the assumption that anything that challenges the official account of a significant government-managed site must be motivated by something other than a genuine evaluation of evidence. This response is understandable as a social phenomenon. Scientific institutions have strong and legitimate reasons to maintain robust defenses against claims that are motivated by ideology or wishful thinking or commercial interest in sensationalism rather than by genuine evidence. A significant portion of what presents itself as alternative archaeology is, in fact, not grounded in serious evidence, and does not deserve serious institutional engagement. The skeptical default serves important functions, but the skeptical default, when applied categorically rather than discriminately, becomes an obstacle to exactly the kind of inquiry it is supposed to protect. When the automatic response to any claim that challenges established frameworks is dismissal based on the category of claim rather than engagement with the specific evidence, genuine anomalies get swept up in the dismissal along with the noise. And in the case of the Yellowstone Underground, the evidence is specific enough and consistent enough across independent sources that it deserves specific engagement rather than categorical dismissal. The specific engagement has not happened, not in any systematic way. The sources that would constitute the primary evidence for a systematic investigation have not been compiled in a form that allows that engagement. The geographic correspondence between those sources has not been mapped in detail. The physical evidence has not been examined using non-invasive contemporary technologies. The oral traditions have not been incorporated into the evidentiary framework with the seriousness they deserve as primary sources about the features of a specific landscape. These are not things that cannot be done. They are things that have not been done. And the reason they have not been done is not that the evidence is absent or that the claim is obviously wrong. It is that the institutional frameworks for determining what gets investigated have not included this question in their scope. Changing that requires exactly the kind of sustained, documented, organized presentation of the evidence that this discussion represents a partial attempt to provide, laying out what is known, identifying the specific sources, demonstrating the geographic correspondence, making the case that the evidence meets a reasonable threshold for serious investigative attention, and repeating that argument in enough different contexts and to enough different audiences that eventually it reaches the people who have the authority and the resources to do something about it. This is slow work. It is frustrating work. It is work that can feel, at times, like shouting into a silence that has chosen not to hear. But it is the work that the evidence calls for. And it is work that, in the history of science, has sometimes eventually succeeded. The evidence does not disappear because it is ignored. It accumulates. It gets better documented. It gets organized into more compelling forms. And eventually, if the underlying claim is sound, the accumulation reaches a tipping point. The Yellowstone Underground evidence has been accumulating for a century and a half. Whether it has reached or can be made to reach the tipping point that would compel systematic investigation is a question that does not yet have an answer. But the evidence is real, the case is strong, and the investigation is possible. There is a specific type of knowledge that exists at the intersection of practical experience and theoretical understanding, the kind of knowledge held by a master craftsperson who can explain in technical terms what they are doing, and also do it with a precision that exceeds what the technical explanation fully accounts for. The kind of knowledge held by a great tracker who can read a landscape with a speed and accuracy that cannot be fully captured in any systematic description of tracking methodology. This kind of knowledge is what the indigenous peoples of the Yellowstone region have about the underground passages. It is not simply practical knowledge, in the sense of knowing where the openings are and how to navigate the passages. It is also not simply theoretical knowledge, in the sense of having an account of what the passages are and why they matter. It is both at once, in the integrated form that deep familiarity with a specific thing over a long time produces. That integrated knowledge is the hardest kind to transfer across cultural and institutional boundaries. It cannot be simply extracted and translated into the language of modern science. It requires the kind of sustained, relationship-based engagement between indigenous knowledge holders and researchers that takes time and commitment and a genuine willingness to learn on the part of the researchers, rather than simply to extract and classify. The model for this kind of engagement exists, as noted above. It has been developed through decades of collaborative research between archaeologists and indigenous communities in various parts of the world. It has produced significant advances in understanding that would not have been achievable through conventional research methodologies alone. And it is the approach that any serious investigation of the Yellowstone Underground would need to incorporate. The challenge is institutional. Collaborative research of this kind requires institutional commitment to its specific methodological demands, including its time requirements, its relationship obligations, and its fundamental reorientation of who counts as an expert and whose knowledge deserves to be centered in the investigation. These are not small asks of institutions that have been organized around quite different assumptions about expertise and authority. but they are asks that are increasingly recognized as necessary and that are being incorporated into research practice in various fields with increasing frequency. Applied to the Yellowstone underground, a genuinely collaborative investigation would look different from a conventional archaeological or geological study of the same features. It would begin by establishing proper relationships with the relevant indigenous communities and earning the trust necessary for those communities to share the full depth of their knowledge about the passages. It would incorporate indigenous knowledge holders as participants in the research design rather than as subjects of study or as consultants brought in after the research framework has been established. It would be accountable to the indigenous communities at every stage of the investigation and would not claim authority to make decisions about what happens with the findings without indigenous input and consent. This is a more complex and more time-consuming approach than a straightforward scientific survey, but it is also more likely to produce complete and accurate knowledge, because the indigenous knowledge it incorporates is not replaceable by any other source. The things that the oral traditions know about the passages that the documentary record does not contain are things that only direct engagement with the knowledge holders can access. An investigation that does not access those things will be systematically incomplete. It is worth saying something directly about the personal experience of spending sustained time with this body of evidence, about what it feels like to go carefully through the primary sources, to map the geographic correspondence between independent accounts, to understand the physical claims in the context of the geological and thermal science, and to watch the picture emerge of something real and consistent and significant that the official account of this landscape does not acknowledge. It is not a comfortable feeling. It is not the feeling of uncovering a dramatic hidden truth that the world has been waiting to know. It is more like the feeling of watching a puzzle assemble in slow motion out of pieces that have been scattered across different boxes, different archives, different cultural traditions, different scientific disciplines, none of which was aware of the other pieces or of the picture they were all contributing to. The picture, once assembled, is clearer than any of the individual pieces. It shows something specific, it shows something consistent, and it shows a gap, a real and substantial gap, between what the evidence says and what the official record acknowledges. That gap is uncomfortable to sit with. It raises questions not just about the specific features of the Yellowstone landscape, but about how institutional knowledge works and fails to work, about the relationship between what is known and what is officially recognized, about the consequences of institutional inertia for our collective understanding of the places we inhabit and the human histories those places hold. The most important thing that the Yellowstone underground case illustrates is that the official record of any significant landscape is not the same as the full truth of that landscape. The official record is a selection. It is shaped by the priorities and assumptions and institutional frameworks of the people who produced it and the organizations that funded and managed the process of production. It contains what those people and organizations were looking for and were prepared to recognize as significant. It does not contain, necessarily, everything that is there to be found. This is not a failure of the official record. It is an inherent limitation of any record produced by any set of institutional processes operating within any particular historical moment. Every generation's official record is incomplete in ways that future generations may find significant. The question is not whether the record is complete, because it is not. The question is how we identify and address the gaps. For the Yellowstone underground, identifying the gap requires going back to the primary sources and reading them on their own terms, without the filters that institutional convention applies to what counts as significant and what does not. Addressing the gap requires the systematic investigation that the evidence calls for. Neither of these things is happening at the scale the situation warrants, but the evidence is there, the case is made, and the possibility of a different outcome, of an investigation that finally closes the gap between the official record and the full reality of this extraordinary landscape, remains open. The long history of the Yellowstone underground evidence is, in one sense, a story about patience. The patience of the land, which has been there with its secrets and its passages and its particular quality of waiting stillness for longer than any institutional record or any oral tradition can fully encompass. The patience of the evidence, which has accumulated across a century and a half of being noted and set aside, and noted again, and set aside again, without ever disappearing or becoming less real. The patience of the indigenous knowledge holders who have maintained their understanding of the underground across generations in the face of a colonial and institutional framework that dismissed it as superstition. And the patience of the researchers who have followed these threads and documented what they found, and continued to make the case that the case is worth making. Patience is not always a virtue in scientific investigation. Sometimes what is needed is urgency. Sometimes the situation demands that institutions move quickly before evidence is lost or before the window for investigation closes. In the case of the Yellowstone Underground, both patience and urgency apply in different dimensions. The physical evidence is patient. The passages are geological in their timescale. The land will hold what it holds for the foreseeable future, but the living knowledge is not patient. The elders who hold the most complete versions of the oral traditions are aging. The informal networks of researchers who have preserved the documentary and observational record are dispersing. The knowledge is real, and the window for accessing it fully is not unlimited. This is the argument for moving the investigation forward now rather than later, not because the mystery is about to expire, but because the knowledge that would most enrich the investigation is still accessible and will not always be. The time to do the work is when the people who can inform it are still here to be consulted. The Yellowstone Underground is ready to be investigated. The evidence is organized. The technology is available. The methodology is developed. The case is strong. And the land, patient as it is as ready to give up its secrets now as it will ever be. What remains is the decision, who makes it, and when. That is where this story sits, not at an ending. At a threshold, the threshold between the question and the answer, between what is known and what can be known, between the long patience of accumulated evidence and the investigation that the evidence has been waiting for. The passages are there. The ground is breathing. The snow refuses to settle in the same circles every winter. The land is speaking in the only language it has. The question is whether anyone is listening, and whether those who are will do something about what they hear. There is a particular quality to the silence of the Yellowstone Plateau on a still morning in late autumn, after the last of the summer visitors have gone and before the winter snows have fully settled in. The park belongs to itself in those weeks in a way that it does not during the tourist season. The elk move through the meadows without detour. The ravens carry on their conversations in the treetops without competition. The thermal features hiss and bubble and plume without an audience, doing what they have always done, what they were doing before there was anyone to watch them. In that silence, the place reveals a quality that visitors see only in glimpses, a depth, a weight of presence that is not atmospheric in any simple sense, but that everyone who has spent extended time in the park, in the quiet seasons reports, in various ways, as feeling like more than the sum of the geological and ecological parts. Like the accumulated presence of everything that has happened here across the full span of time that this place has been inhabited and observed and used and cared for by people who knew it in ways that we are still learning to approximate. That weight of presence is real. It is not imagined. It is the physical effect of time and history concentrated in a specific landscape. Every place that has been inhabited for a long time has this quality, but few places have it with the intensity of Yellowstone, because few places have the combination of geological extremity and human depth that makes this place what it is. The geology is thousands of millions of years old. The human habitation is tens of thousands of years deep. The intersection of those two scales of time in a single landscape creates something that affects everyone who comes here, with enough openness to notice it. What lies beneath that landscape? In the passages that the evidence points toward and the oral traditions describe and the thermal data suggests and the explorers found and then found reasons not to write about, is part of what gives the place that particular quality of presence. Because the underground is not separate from the above ground in the way that a basement is separate from the house above it. It is continuous with it. It is part of the same geological and historical reality. And if the underground holds what the evidence suggests it holds, the presence of those passages and whatever is in them is part of the felt weight of this place, in ways that cannot be fully articulated, but that register in the experience of everyone who comes here with enough time and enough attention. The Yellowstone Underground is not a separate mystery from Yellowstone itself. It is the underground of Yellowstone, the deep part, the old part, the part that has not been fully reckoned with. And reckoning with it fully, if that reckoning ever happens, will change how we understand not just this specific place, but the full depth of the human relationship with this landscape and with the geological processes that have shaped it. It will add something to the official story of Yellowstone that has been missing from that story for as long as the official story has existed. Something real, something significant, something that the land itself has been trying to tell in every language at its disposal for longer than any of the institutions currently responsible for this place have been in existence. The story of how knowledge reaches us from the distant past is always a story of survival, of what survived and what did not, of the specific accidents and decisions and material properties that determined which pieces of the past made it to the present in recoverable form and which were lost to time and deterioration, and the processes that dissolve organic matter and scatter stone and erode the physical signatures of human presence back into the undifferentiated geological record. What survives is not random, though it has random elements. What survives is shaped by what was made of durable materials, by what was placed in protected environments, by what was significant enough to be maintained across generations, by what was in locations that experienced preservation-favorable conditions, and by what was carried in living memory by people who understood its importance and took the care to transmit it faithfully. The evidence for the Yellowstone Underground has survived through all of these channels. The documentary historical sources survived because they were made of paper and filed in institutions that preserved paper. The oral traditions survived because they were maintained by people who understood their importance and transmitted them with the discipline that oral cultures develop for preserving what matters. The physical passages themselves have survived, if the evidence is accurate, because they were underground, in environments that are, in the absence of catastrophic volcanic activity, extraordinarily stable over geological timescales. And the thermal and geological signatures of the passages have survived in the physical landscape in forms detectable by modern sensing technologies. The survival of all these different forms of evidence, across all these different channels, in ways that converge on the same location and the same basic features, is itself significant. It suggests that what they are all pointing toward is something that was substantial enough and significant enough to leave multiple independent traces across the full span of its history. Not a casual feature, not a marginal detail, something important enough to be recorded in oral traditions and in government field notes and in geological data and in the winter behavior of the snow on the ground above it. Important things have a way of surviving in multiple forms. The more important something was, the more channels it tends to have found its way into, because more people noticed it, and more people had reason to remember it, and more of its physical characteristics were significant enough to leave detectable traces. The multi-channel survival of the Yellowstone underground evidence is consistent with its being something important, something that mattered enough to the people who knew it to preserve knowledge of it across thousands of years, something physically substantial enough to leave geological signatures. Something significant enough that government surveyors who encountered it felt it worth noting even when they chose not to include it in their official reports. The importance of the thing is suggested by the character of its survival, and the character of its survival suggests that the investigation of it would produce findings of corresponding importance. Not just interesting, important. Significant to our understanding of the pre-Columbian history of this continent. Significant to the understanding of the people whose ancestors are part of that history. Significant to the management of this extraordinary landscape in ways that honor its full depth rather than only its surface features. There are places in the world where the past is more present than elsewhere, where the accumulated weight of what has happened in a location over a long time creates a quality of presence that is physically perceptible, even to people who have no prior knowledge of the location's history. Archaeological sites often have this quality. Sacred sites have it. Locations that have been the scene of significant human events have it. And locations that are geologically extraordinary and have been inhabited for very long periods tend to have it in concentrated form. Yellowstone is one of those locations. The geological extremity of the place creates a physical environment that is vivid and intense in ways that heighten awareness and alter the ordinary relationship between human consciousness and its surroundings. The long human habitation of the place has deposited layer upon layer of human presence in the landscape, in the soil and the archaeology and the oral traditions, and the specific ways that people have shaped and responded to this environment across thousands of years. And the underground dimension of the place, if the evidence is accurate, adds another layer of depth and intensity to this already extraordinary quality. The specific area of the Central Plateau, where the evidence for the passages converges, has a reputation among people who spend significant time in the park. Not a dramatic reputation, not the kind of reputation that generates tourist interest or appears in park publications. A quieter reputation, passed among people who take the place seriously, as an area that is somehow different. That has a quality of attention that the surrounding landscape does not have in the same degree. That feels inhabited in a way that goes beyond the visible wildlife and the documented archaeological sites. That reputation is consistent with what the evidence suggests is actually there. A significant underground complex of passages with unusual physical characteristics in a geologically extreme environment, in a landscape that has been inhabited and cared for by people with sophisticated knowledge of the underground for thousands of years. Of course, that would create a quality of presence that perceptive observers register as distinct. The environment that creates it is distinct. It is as distinct as it is because of what is in it, both above and below ground. Taking the evidence seriously means taking this quality of presence seriously as part of the record, not as supernatural evidence of something beyond physical reality, but as the physical and psychological effect of a genuinely unusual environment that has a character distinct from the surrounding landscape because it actually has distinct features that the evidence points toward and that the investigation would reveal. The investigation would reveal what is actually there. That is its purpose and its promise. Replacing the accumulated testimony of independent sources with direct physical documentation. Replacing the convergent picture assembled from disparate evidence with the definitive picture produced by systematic survey. Replacing the quality of presence that perceptive observers register and struggle to account for with a precise understanding of what produces it. The investigation is possible. The evidence warrants it. The technology exists to conduct it without disturbance to the landscape. The institutional authority to authorize it exists. The indigenous knowledge that would most enrich it is still accessible. The question is whether the decision will be made to pursue it. That question remains open. The evidence does not close it. The argument does not close it. Only the decision closes it. And the decision belongs to people who have not yet made it. But the evidence accumulates. The case becomes stronger. The anomaly grows more difficult to ignore. And the landscape, patient and old and full of what it holds, continues to offer what it has always offered to anyone willing to pay attention. The truth of what lies beneath. Waiting in the specific darkness of the passages. Waiting in the breathing of the underground. Waiting in the circles in the winter snow. Waiting in the sound that comes from below, in the specific areas of the central plateau. Waiting, as the land has always waited, for whoever is ready to receive what it has to give. The passages are real. The investigation is possible. The knowledge that awaits is worth having. The rest is a decision, one that the evidence has been asking for a very long time, and that the land, in its patient geological way, will continue to ask for as long as it takes. There is one more thing worth saying before this account closes. Something about what it means to care about a question like this one. About why the underground passages of Yellowstone matter, not just as an archaeological or geological or historical puzzle, but as a question about who we are and how we relate to the places we inhabit and the deep human histories those places contain. We live in a time when the management of natural landscapes is increasingly understood as a matter of ecological significance. The national parks of the United States are recognized as treasures worth protecting not just for their beauty but for the ecological functions they perform, the biodiversity they harbor, the climate services they provide, the wild character of the land they preserve against the relentless pressure of development and exploitation. This ecological understanding has expanded enormously in the past several generations and continues to expand as our understanding of ecosystem complexity and interdependence deepens. What has not expanded at the same rate in the management of these landscapes is the understanding of the human historical depth they contain. The archaeological and historical richness of places like Yellowstone is recognized in principle and addressed in limited practical ways through artifact protection and site documentation and the consultation processes required by federal law when management decisions might affect known archaeological resources. But the full depth of the human history of these landscapes remains largely outside the framework of active management attention. The underground passages of Yellowstone are an example of what that human historical depth can contain that the current management framework is not adequately equipped to recognize and engage with. They are not alone. There are similar situations at other significant landscapes across the continent, where the deep pre-Columbian history of the place contains features and knowledge and significance that official management frameworks have not found ways to fully incorporate. Expanding those frameworks to include the full depth of the human history of significant landscapes is a long-term project. It requires changes in institutional culture, in research priorities, in the legal and regulatory structures that govern landscape management, and in the relationships between managing institutions and the indigenous communities whose knowledge is most relevant to understanding the pre-Columbian dimensions of these landscapes. The Yellowstone Underground is a specific and relatively well-documented case within this larger pattern. It is a place where the evidence is sufficient to make a concrete case for a specific investigation that would expand institutional knowledge in specific ways. It is a place where the convergence of independent evidence sources across multiple disciplines and multiple centuries creates a case that is, by the standards of any reasonable assessment of what warrants investigation, strong enough to act on. Acting on it would require decisions by specific institutions and specific people. The National Park Service, as the managing agency for the Yellowstone landscape, has authority over research conducted in the park. The United States Geological Survey has expertise in subsurface geological investigation and a mandate that includes the scientific characterization of significant geological features. The academic institutions with relevant research programs in archaeology, geology, and indigenous studies have the methodological expertise to design and conduct an appropriate investigation. And the indigenous communities with historical ties to the landscape have both the knowledge and the legal standing to be central participants in any investigation of features that are part of their cultural heritage. The institutional framework for the investigation exists. The evidence that warrants it exists. The technology that would enable it exists. What remains is the convergence of will and authority and resources around the specific decision to pursue it. That convergence has not happened yet. But the evidence continues to accumulate, the case continues to be made, and the landscape continues to offer, to anyone willing to pay the kind of attention it deserves, the same information it has always offered, the same quality of presence, the same winter snow circles, the same sound from below, the same specific character of the air at the passage openings that every independent observer across every independent tradition has noticed and described in terms that point toward the same thing. The passages are there, the investigation is possible, the knowledge is worth having, and the land, patient as it always has been, continues to wait for whoever comes next, with better tools, with open eyes, with the willingness to let the evidence be what it is, rather than what the frameworks would prefer it to be. That is the end of this account, not the end of the story. The story will not end until the investigation happens, or until the evidence is fully and honestly engaged with, by institutions that have the resources to do it justice. Until then, the plateau breathes. The steam rises. And below the boardwalks and the geysers and the 2 million acres of extraordinary, managed, imperfectly understood wilderness, something old and real and significant waits in the particular darkness of the deep underground for the moment when we finally decide to look. There is something worth acknowledging, at the very end of an account this long and this detailed, about the experience of spending time with evidence that points towards something the official record does not acknowledge. It is not a comfortable experience. It carries a specific kind of weight that comes from holding a genuine tension between what the evidence shows and what institutional authority says is real. That tension is not resolved by this account. It will not be resolved until the investigation happens. And the investigation will not happen until institutions make the decision to conduct it. That decision is not made by the evidence alone. It is made by people, operating within institutions, responding to pressures and priorities and cultural frameworks that shape what they see as worth doing. The evidence presented here is an attempt to be one of those pressures, to add its weight, however modest, to the cumulative force of everything that points toward the investigation. To be part of what eventually tips the balance from the comfortable inertia of not looking to the more demanding but more honest work of looking and finding out what is actually there. The underground of Yellowstone deserves that work. The people whose ancestors built whatever is there and maintained knowledge of it across thousands of years deserve it. The scientific record of this continent deserves it. And the landscape itself, in whatever way a landscape can be said to deserve anything, has been patient long enough. The tunnels are there. The evidence is there. The case is made. Now it is time to look. And whatever looking reveals, the knowing of it will be better than the not knowing. Better for the science. Better for the history. Better for the relationships between the institutions that manage this land and the peoples whose ancestors made it what it is. Better for everyone who cares about the full depth of what this extraordinary place contains and means. The plateau holds its secrets. The passages hold what they hold. The land breathes its slow, old, patient breath. And somewhere in the specific darkness of tunnels that have been there since before anyone who is alive today was born, The record of what was built and used and understood in this place by people who knew it more deeply than we do is waiting, as it has always waited, for whoever comes with the right questions and the willingness to let the answers be what they are. That is all any of us can bring to a question this old and this real. The willingness to ask honestly and to receive honestly what the asking returns. The willingness to revise what we knew in the light of what we actually find. The willingness to let the land teach us what it has been trying to teach, for as long as there have been people here to learn from it. The tunnels beneath Yellowstone are waiting. They have always been waiting, and they will continue to wait, patient as stone and old as the caldera that created the landscape above them, until someone finally goes and looks. And when they do, when someone finally stands at the threshold of one of those passages with proper equipment and institutional authority and the genuine intention of understanding rather than confirming what they already believe, the first thing they will need to do is stop. To stand at the opening and let the air from the underground meet the air from above, to feel the temperature change and the change in the quality of the air, to hear whatever sound is there to be heard, to let the place be what it is before they begin the work of measuring and sampling and documenting and interpreting. Because before you can understand something genuinely old and genuinely significant, you have to be willing to let it be strange, to let it resist your frameworks before you impose your frameworks on it, to receive what it offers before you decide what it is. That is the discipline that good science and genuine historical inquiry both require, and it is harder than it sounds in a culture that values explanation over encounter, knowing over noticing, the satisfaction of classification over the discomfort of genuine mystery. The tunnels of Yellowstone are, among other things, an invitation to that discipline, to slow down, to look carefully, to let the evidence be what it is, to follow where it leads without deciding in advance where it is going, to be genuinely open to what is there rather than what the frameworks say should be there. That openness, applied to this landscape, with the full resources of contemporary science and the full depth of indigenous knowledge and the honest engagement with all the sources that have been pointing at this same place for this long, would produce something worth having, something real, something that changes how we understand this landscape and this history and the people who made it what it is. That is what is at stake in this question. Not just a geological puzzle, not just an archaeological mystery, the full depth of the human story of this extraordinary place, and whether we are willing, finally, to take that story seriously enough to find out what it actually contains. The passages wait, the evidence accumulates, the case is made, the rest is up to us.